have the misfortune of meeting the bloodthirsty zealot, I implore you to hold your tongue. Astrid squinted. You need me in one piece. Why is that? HMPH. Why indeed? Viggo said, turning in place to survey the bare room. Apparently, the only way to have the purest form of revenge on Hiccup is to make him suffer by watching his family suffer. And the only way to do that is to keep you in one piece until the allotted time. Oh gods. Or so I am told. I'm quite sure Hiccup would never settle for anything less than a harebrained rescue attempt, probably mostly successful. He would never fall to pieces in the face of such barbarics. In fact, he wouldn't allow it even get that far. Astrid said nothing. Viggo didn't know their past though. He didn't know the things Hiccup had had to do, the sacrifices he'd had to make, the lines he'd had to cross to secure his family's safety over the years. Hiccup was not the same man as when Viggo left. In many ways, this was a good thing. But Hiccup was also afraid. Terrified to lose what he loved so dearly. And that made him vulnerable. And the fact that she didn't come home. Oh gods, the worry had to be eating him alive. However, Viggo said. Alton gave me as much information as he could regarding the story with Brandine. Grabbing a nearby chair, Viggo slid it just out of Astrid's reach and sat down. It sounds like time has changed my game, partner. I wish to know the details. Astrid set her jaw. Go to hell, Viggo. Viggo smiled. I thought you'd say that. Which is why you are going to tell me everything I wish to know. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and smiled. Or I will have to employ certain measures. You won't hurt me. Don't be daft, Astrid. I don't need to hurt you. I already have exactly what I need to make you talk. Astrid stared just over his shoulder and saw Alton close his eyes in defeat. Zoe set a hand on his forehead with the pretense of checking his temperature, but the empathetic look on her face gave her away. Viggo's brown eye held a certain glint. A bluff? No. She wouldn't call that bluff. She wouldn't allow them to hurt Alton anymore. Viggo was bound to find things out anyway, as he was prone to do. She only hoped Hiccup would forgive her. Sighing through her nose, Astrid set her head back against the wall in defeat. What do you want to know? Viggo's smile was just as cunning as it had been 20 years ago. Just as Alton said. Tell me everything. Chapter 8, Ocean's Rise. Chapter text. Astrid had begun to remember that there were many obnoxious things involved with being captured. Hunger and thirst had to be chief among them. Plus the stinging of wounds and the ache in her lungs. All these things she kept to herself though. There was no use in wallowing, and besides, Alton was clearly in worse shape than she was. Besides, she was in better shape now than she had the last time she'd been captured. Pushing the dark, painful memories of that old cell from her mind, Astrid kept a cool eye on Zoe as she treated Alton's wounds. Her dark skin shone under the lamp swinging back and forth on the chain above her shoulder. Her touch was both gentle and firm when needed. A healer's hands. Many slaves had a specific job or role, and clearly this was no different. The girl, who seemed to be in her mid-20s, was clearly experienced. Astrid had no doubt that she'd seen many injuries, especially if she was under Viggo's thumb. She was tall and thin but stalwart. She spoke to Alton in soft tones that she either thought didn't carry or she simply didn't care if Astrid heard what she said. But she did. This might hurt. No lies from the healer today. Lies do not become us. Zoe's accent was a little difficult to decipher at times, but she spoke Norse well enough. She must have been in the north for some time then, to know the language so well. Or perhaps she was a quick study. My brother-in-law's aunt, she's our village healer. Mara. She always said it would be a light prick and then you'd get a searing pain. Lies and deceit all the way. A soft smile lifted Zoe's lips as she tied a new bandage around his bicep, covering the freshly cleaned cuts. Astrid had cringed at the sight of the stitched skin, healing but no less irritated. The stitches were even, clean. She must have done stitches a million times to have such a proficient hand. Sometimes we must take care with our words. If someone is in great pain, do we tell them it is all right? Or, if they are about to be in more pain, Do we upset them by telling them to expect it, and their body reacts in ways they cannot control? It is difficult to say. So Alton said, pausing to swallow. In summary, selective lies become us then. When necessary. Zoe stood back. I suppose you are right. Her dark eyes flicked to Astrid, but she said nothing. I must change the bandages on your face. I saved those for last. Alton pursed his lips and only nodded. Astrid wondered if these had been saved for last for his benefit or hers. She watched in stoic silence as Zoe peeled off the wrapping covering the side of his face and stepped back to grab a fresh rag from her tray. Astrid sucked in a breath. A long cut had been carved into his face, starting above his eyebrow and curving down around his eye, ending at the top of his cheekbone. Similar to the same cuts that Zoe herself must have received once, judging by the raised scars on her face. That bad, huh? Astrid stiffened, coming back to herself. She averted her eyes and said nothing. How could she be so stupid, to let him see her reaction, when it was his face? It's okay, Alton said in a low voice. He turned his face back toward the ceiling as Zoe returned. He grit his teeth as she set the cleaning cloth against the cut. Bitter truths over sweet lies. Despite herself, despite everything she knew in her heart that she needed to do to stay focused, to not let herself slip, Astrid's eyes burned. She remembered when Alton was just a toddler, running after his older brother with mischievous light in its eyes. Kurt used to pick him up and swing him around, cackling and screaming, only stopping when Joan would scold him, only for fear of tearing the little boy's arms out of their sockets. Kurt would set his little brother down and watch him fight the dizziness. Little Alton stumbled a little, but he always caught his footing. He never fell. And then he was off like a terror, auburn hair bouncing in the wind. Strangely enough, the mental image reminded her of Darren and Finn. Her boys who had such reckless abandon and wide, joyful blue eyes. She looked back at Alton as Zoe set a clean cloth on the cut, setting it with a sort of adhesive material similar to what Mara used to keep wrappings on. She thought of Clyde and Joan, who'd already lit the pyre of one fearless son. This would not be his fate. To die alone here in the belly of this ship. She wouldn't allow it. The creaking of hinges signaled the sound of heavy footsteps. Astrid scowled as Brandine and 4 guards entered the room, all smirking. Viggo brought up the rear, scowling. The hours-long discussion they'd had the night before had been taxing. To reveal all her family's secrets to not only Viggo but to Alton and a complete stranger, Zoe, was something she never wanted to experience again. And yet there was something in Viggo's eyes that seemed to call out to her as he leaned against the far wall and crossed his arms. Something like sympathy, perhaps. Astrid hissed through her teeth, glad for the distraction of the guards that hauled her to her feet. Viggo could take his god's-forsaken sympathy and... Congratulations, Astrid. Brandine said, raising his voice over the clank of chains. You've been upgraded to the Master Suite. No more cold cells, no more chit-chats with Viggo. Aren't you pleased? Struggling against the guards, Astrid tried to launch herself forward to tear his eyes out with her bare hands, but the guards held her back. They were broad-shouldered and chested. Why did the villains always seem to have a surplus of all the brawniest Vikings? Do try to behave, Astrid. Viggo said dryly. Hiccup is already painfully worried about you, especially after tonight. We wouldn't want to prove any of his fears true. Astrid went still, her already bruised hands going numb beneath the guard's iron grip. What did you do? Brandine smirked. Oh, just sent him a message or two. I hope you didn't have any particular fondness for your ex. It's been disposed of. Oh, don't you worry, Astrid said. I have many. Yes, I've seen your collection. But you won't be going home to Berk for a while yet, and by that point, it will be irrelevant. You won't ever hold a weapon in your hands again. Don't need one. Astrid said before striking out with her foot on the inner sole of the guard to her right, whom she noticed upon entry had seemed to be favoring his left knee. He howled, reflexively reaching for his foot, and didn't see her clamber up his body and kick off, sending herself and the other guard careening across the room. They crashed to the floor and Astrid rolled, shoving her knee into the man's windpipe and wrenching her arm free. Before she could move, a pair of strong arms banded around her chest and lifted her upward. She thrashed and kicked and bucked, but it was a wise move. She had very limited movement now. Then a fist struck her in the stomach right beneath her rib cage. All sound faded as she jackknifed, gasping in pain. The guard holding her tightened his hold and she struggled now, fighting for air. Release her so she can breathe. A dark voice shouted. Viggo. A moment later she crashed to the floor, clutching her stomach and willing the pain to ease. Finally she sucked in a breath, her lungs and stomach positively aching. Still as the echoing pains began to fade she clawed back onto her hands and knees. She wouldn't let them see her like this, wouldn't. Someone snatched her up by her hair and dragged her upward, slamming her into the iron wall behind her. She groaned at the pain radiating everywhere. Brandine's face was 2 inches from hers. My plan, he hissed, was only to send a box to Burke to make Hiccup think your head was in it. Don't make me actually send it. Astrid went still. What? A muscle flickered in Viggo's jaw over Brandine's shoulder, even as Alton blanched a few paces away. Oh. Hiccup. Yes, everything is very delicate at the moment. So unless you wish me to shatter him into a million pieces by sending you back in pieces, I suggest you get a grip. Brandine added in a fierce whisper. Then, audaciously, he brushed a lock of her blonde hair off her cheekbone. Strange. I know she has Hiccup's face. But this close, you remind me of her. A spike of white-hot rage shot through Astrid's chest at that, overwhelming the pain and frustration and anguish. Viggo's dark eye flared and he tilted his jaw once, as if in a single solitary no. He didn't want her to die here. But why? Why would he care? Brandine smirked. Better. He released her and was instantly replaced by the 3 remaining guards. Take her to my ship. We're on a tight schedule. Astrid was hauled away but she yanked back. Alton. Alton, don't give up. Whatever happens next, don't give up. They hauled her away, but not before she saw a familiar stubbornness enter his eyes. He nodded and was gone as a bag was thrown over her head. They trudged through darkness until they exited what she knew to be the creaky door that led to another hallway. Astrid did her best to memorize the way as they climbed multiple sets of stairs, her toes knocking into many on the way. After 4 flights, they paused, but only momentarily. One of the guards bent and hauled her onto his shoulder, causing her to grunt as the top of her head hit someone's shoulder. Watch it, you big oaf. The man grunted and began to climb, a ladder, she quickly surmised. He carelessly allowed her head to smack on the edge of the deck as the atmosphere began to change. She was outside. Tyron, try not to addle her brains too much. I need her alert and in one piece. Sir. There was a moment of open space and uneven wood beneath her feet, which made her think of Adriana's stories of pirate ships and innocents forced to walk a rickety plank before being shoved off by sword point to their water grave. Soon she was dragged onto more solid wood and onto another ship. She wished she could see something beyond the tiny holes of the Black Hood, but it was useless. Darkness had fallen and it did little to offer her any information as to their whereabouts. A series of growls sounded at her ankles as they walked, laced with irritation. Astrid tried to place the species of dragon but it was too difficult over the sounds of chiffons shouting orders, the beating of sails and dragon wings, and heavy footfalls. There had to be hundreds of people on this ship alone. Depending on its size and how many ships Brandine had at his disposal. Hurry. I don't like not seeing what she's thinking. Her silence doesn't bode well. Astrid smirked. Nervous, Brandine. Brandine planted a hand on her back and shoved hard, but she expected it and only stumbled a few steps before catching her footing. What's to be nervous about? I've got the key to Hiccup's heart right here. I could jump ship and drown, then you lose your leverage. Nah. See, this is why I'm the mastermind behind the plans, not you. See, if you kill yourself, it would give Hiccup a small amount of satisfaction that you had your way in the end and it would give him fuel to fight, despite the grief. Effective, but it doesn't quite have the same punch as killing you in front of him would. And you're trying to convince me not to kill myself because Brandine grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back against his chest so he could say into her ear. You wouldn't take the coward's way out. Not even to save him. He shoved her forward and she met open air. Training kicked in as she rolled, grunting in pain as hips and shoulders and knees smacked into stairs. Mercifully she didn't hit her face on anything, at least not directly. Finally she slammed onto the floor with a groan. Her entire body ached. If Brandine didn't quit knocking her around, then she'd never have strength to fight. She belatedly realized that was probably the plan. Laughing, the men reached the bottom of the staircase and snatched her back off the floor. The air was significantly colder here and the darkness even thicker, which meant they were now in the belly of Brandine's ship. It certainly felt bigger than Viggo's, which had felt compact as it rocked on the waves. This ship felt broad and was teeming with hundreds of soldiers and dragons. Soon a door was shoved open and Astrid was pushed into a chair. Footsteps exited the room just as quickly and in moments, the bag was ripped off her head. She was in a fairly large office. Windows covered the entire back wall. On both sides of the room were bookcases and shelving units, and on the walls were hung various exploits and treasures from apparent journeys, though Brandine's own or another's, she'd never know. Maps and animal pelts, compasses and tapestries, and even a massive colorful rug, likely from somewhere far away. Even two massive potted trees stood vigil on either side of the window, giving the room a touch of the outdoors that would have been lacking otherwise. Astrid hoped that Brandine hadn't decorated this place because whoever did had exceptional taste, and she wouldn't be caught dead thinking he had good taste in anything. Brandine walked around a broad oak desk, stained with a rich brown oil. It was covered in papers, folders, maps and writing utensils, all in efficient stacks. The organization was pristine and sent a familiar, distasteful pang through her, remembering how organized Brandine's house had been when he'd lived on Berk. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. And yet, such organization could be predictable. No doubt why having Viggo in his entourage made him nervous. He couldn't control Viggo, no matter how organized he was. Impressive, I know. Brandine said, sitting at last and folding his arms behind his head as he leaned back in his chair. This is where all the magic happens. Magic? Astrid scoffed. She glanced around the room at large, taking in the dozens of bookshelves filled to the brim with hundreds, if not thousands of books. I thought you hated to read. Brandine laughed. Oh Astrid. Do you think you ever truly knew me at all? No, I only hated reading Adriana's pointless tripe. He glanced up at the ceiling. Fiction is useless. But the real world is wider and vaster than the mind can possibly consume. There are places so far from here that we could never dream of, and yet they are full of beauty and wonder. No imagination could possibly compare. Once I might have agreed with you. But people do dream, Astrid said. That's where stories come from. We dream, we see and experience things, we shape and mold and make stories of our own. If you're so knowledgeable of the world, then you should know better than to speak ill of art. Art? Who said we were talking about art? Brandine grinned, then shook his head. There is a lot to be gained and learned from a world that has been grown and shaped by wars, by men and even women who saw something they wanted and were willing to pay whatever price to get it. Drawing and writing didn't do that. Ambition and sacrifice did that. Sacrifice? Astrid demanded. Yes. It comes at no little cost to do the things we conquerors do. Astrid shook her head. What I would give for this entire fight to be centered around Viggo and not you. Brandine glared, as if offended. Why? I don't see what the big deal is. Because you always underestimate the smartest in the room. Like Hiccup and Eric, Viggo. Eric. Brandine scoffed. Don't make me laugh. And yet he stood from his desk and began to pace, clearly agitated. Larson is the definition of weak. He should have died on that platform, but no, I suppose that would have been too easy. Too convenient. Astrid watched as he paced, hands clenched at his sides, blue eyes shadowed. Brandine and Eric had always had a rivalry. Eric had never liked Brandine and the feeling had been mutual. They'd eventually realized that Eric had a keen instinct, one that would not buy into Brandine's lies. But Brandine's hatred of Eric seemed to run much deeper than that. You're jealous. Brandine whipped around. What? You're jealous of Eric? Astrid could hardly say the words for how disgusting they were, but judging by his reaction, she knew she was right. What are you jealous of exactly? That he actually is as smart as you. Or the fact that Adrana still chose him over you every time. Something flickered in his otherwise blank expression at that, and he turned away, glaring out the massive window at the back of the ship. From this view, she could see the dozens of lines of ships moored in some harbor. Information she should have been compiling up until now, but she hadn't noticed. Though her insides squirmed with distaste at the mere thought, Astrid wondered if, even in his own twisted, perverted way, if he actually had cared for Adriana. It was no excuse for how he'd treated her. He'd never deserved her. But even the most evil people could still care for someone, even if their motivations were entirely wrong, even if they didn't know what it was to truly love someone in the way they needed or in a way that was right. But maybe Brandine hated Eric so much because he knew he lost. Adriana was the key to everything. Astrid blinked out of her thoughts. Brandine was still turned away. His voice was low and contemplative, and he almost sounded normal. The way he used to when he'd spend time at the Haddock house, shamelessly flirting with Adriana over dinner or joking with Finn or even having debates with Hiccup. He'd fit into their family like a glove, and it had all been a horrible, disgusting lie, and yet. Brandine crossed his arms. I knew early on, even the first time I met her and Hiccup, that if I was going to do this, I'd have to be smart. I'd have to play my cards right. For a long time it was a game and it got easy. She was an easy target. A gift here, a kiss there, a flirtation there. It only got taxing after she grew up a little, when she stopped looking at me. When the things I'd say stopped mattering and I'd always find her looking at him. Astrid heard a note of disdain in his voice. A hint of the poison. After that it didn't matter what I did. Things weren't the same. I don't think she even realized that we were heading toward a breakup, one that most people would have seen coming based on how we were acting and treating each other. I used every trick in the book and it meant nothing, because even though she tried to stay loyal, because she's a good person. He shook his head. She couldn't stay away from him. Though she hated to hear it, Astrid realized that nobody knew Brandine's side of the story. She wanted no part in his side of it, his motivations or feelings. She wanted to break free of this chair and take him apart for everything he'd ever done to her daughter, to lying to her for years. She didn't want to hear any more of his story. Then he kissed her. That's when I knew I needed to up my game, because she was the key to everything I was building, and if I lost her then I'd have to start from scratch. Astrid was shaking. Up your game. You raped her. Brandine whipped around. Do you think that was the plan? Shut up. Astrid roared, and to her surprise, he flinched back. You're a disgusting don't. She took a few calming breaths, though the rage was hot enough that angry tears began to well up in her eyes. Do not try to make excuses to me. Brandine's face had darkened. It never had to be this way. If she'd just cooperated, and before you bite my head off, I'm not even talking about sex. You had no right. She was supposed to marry me. Brandine shouted. After years of putting up with it all and lying and even cheating with Dana to take the edge off, she still ran to him at every turn. That wasn't part of the plan. Astrid was trembling and breathing with great difficulty. What, in the God's green earth, did you expect after you did that to her? Did you think you could manipulate her one last time into loving you, after doing that? Brandine shook his head and looked away. The fear did its job for a while. But Larsen wouldn't back off, and I never planned for it to happen. But that's when she told me she kissed Eric, that she cheated, and I just saw red. But I knew, later on I knew that I screwed up. That no matter how hard I tried after that, I'd lose her in the end. Astrid wanted to simultaneously scream and weep, but she suddenly felt exhausted. You're a disgusting monster. There was a quiet pause. She kept her eyes away, not wanting to look at him anymore or see if her words had any impact. She felt raw and exposed, taken back in time to 3.5 years ago when she'd found out her daughter had run away because she was pregnant and felt so horribly alone. That her boyfriend, a young man they'd all thought might someday be family, had hurt her in the most horrible way. Well, Brandine said, an airiness to his tone that was clearly meant to change the subject. At least one good thing came of it. Astrid stiffened. Darin. She said nothing. I hear he's bride for 3. Astrid kept her mouth shut. She'd get nothing from her regarding her grandson. Nothing. Brandine sniffed and she soon realized he was smiling. Fine, keep your secrets. I'll meet him soon enough. Now Astrid stared him full in the face with a glare. Leave him alone. You've done enough. If you feel anything for Adriana, misplaced love, guilt, whatever the hell it is, you will leave Darin alone. Typical. Brandine sat back in his chair with a small smile. We'll cross that bridge later. But I'd say we're very much off topic. He flipped open a folder atop the expansive map on his desk. Now the reason you've been brought onto my ship is because we're heading out to sea soon. We've got a great deal of ocean to cover and as we're on a tight schedule, we'd better get going. I admit I didn't anticipate you being here, so this only adds to the fun. I can execute a few of my plans early, in fact. Astrid rolled her eyes. Stupid, so unbelievably stupid of her. Where's Stormfly? Brandine also rolled his eyes. Again, typical. She's fine, she's on Viggo's ship. Not, he added dryly. That it matters. Viggo's portion of the Armada is naturally intended for capturing dragons, so you probably won't be seeing him anytime soon. Or, by extension, Stormfly. She glanced at the map, forcing her irritation down. So what exactly is the master plan? I assume once you took Berserker you were going to set up camp, but Sven took that from you. Yes and no, I always intended on taking Berserker back first. Naturally, it's my birthright. But I never planned to stay there. Sven blowing it to smithereens only saved me time. Astrid glared. In any case. Brandine said and began to talk. He spoke for a few minutes, explaining bits and pieces of his plan. She knew he had to be leaving out key details, but the splitting up of his army, sending some one direction, sending others another, she had to admit it was smart. It also told her that this army was indeed very large. It sent a squirm of fear through her stomach, though she fought not to show it. And when he told her what new role she would play in this master plan, she shook her head. Hiccup won't take the bait. For you, he will. You and I both know he's fretting something terrible by now. Astrid merely stared back, trying to convey with her eyes just how much she hated him. How much she wished she could take him apart. For hurting her daughter, her family, for nearly killing her son, for allowing Alton to be tortured for Burke's secrets. For putting Hiccup through so much worry and stress. She could see the challenge in his eyes, too. He wanted her to beg for mercy. Well, he'd get no begging from her. She'd rather die than give him the satisfaction. But Hiccup. Astrid looked away, hating the way Brandine smirked. She would be strong for Hiccup. She could be stubborn and fearless in the face of all of it. But the thought of Hiccup being in pain, of being put through that. That's where her cracks started to show. And Brandine saw right through her. Fret not, Astrid. Brandine said, standing and straightening his leather jerkin. I don't plan to touch Hiccup. No, I'd rather he live a long, healthy life. So he can suffer alone well into old age. Despite everything, Astrid shook her head. How can you hate anyone so much? To wish that on anyone. Brandine bent down so they were nearly face to face. Simple. He's always preaching that love is a choice, right? Well, so is this burning hatred. So you admit that you could choose to do things differently. To not do any of this. I could, but why would I? Unlike Viggo, games bore me. People are expendable because they're not just pieces in a game. There are real stakes and real victories and real losses. And watching the devastation as valuable people are taken away from your opponent one by one. Watching them crack under the pressure of having to make decisions that will put those valuable people in danger. Brandine gave a slow smile. There is no greater satisfaction. Astrid's jaw hurt from gritting her teeth so tightly. You are everything that is deplorable about this world. Granted. Which is exactly why I'm winning this war. Because I'm willing to go the extra mile, to make the hard sacrifices. What exactly have you sacrificed, Brandine? Nobody loves you, except maybe your mother. And you sacrificed her the moment you decided to be this, because she'd had enough. She knew she couldn't redeem you from what you were turning into. So what other hard sacrifices have you made exactly? Brandine made a face. Come on, Astrid, you're smarter than this. Do you think this army came for free? I've got a lot of debts to pay. That certainly warrants a lot of sacrifice, because if I don't pay up in the next few weeks, why? I'll have an army 3 times this size after me. Bounty hunters and bloodthirsty kings alike do not best friends make, you know. Oh, I see. Astrid said. So your sacrifices are your freedom. Debt collection is no small thing. How noble of you to take on such a sacrifice. I know. Brandine said, ignoring her jibe. And I plan to pay it in every possible way I can. Astrid blinked. Such as? Now. Can't get too far ahead of ourselves, can we? Brandine straightened. After all, I need you there for my big finale. Which is, of course, one reason I had to separate you from Alton. Wouldn't want you to get any ideas about escaping. Taking extra precautions. Good. Astrid smiled. Then you know I could very well do it. Of course, you could. I have no doubts about that. Brandine said. Which is exactly why you're under a 24-hour watch from now on. Oh, and they'll be doubling your chains and the locks on your doors. There are 24 men on every door on every deck of this ship should something miraculous happen to get you out of your cell. And, to boot, if you do try anything, I'll kill Alton. I don't care what Viggo says. Baby Brand has served his purpose and he should be sleeping with the fishes by now. So please, if you truly want him to live to see his next birthday, don't test me. The morning light was a dusky grey, devoid of color. Normally the Jatan sunrises were full of beauty and wonder. Maybe because Jat represented everything that was beautiful in the world. Music. Joy. Happiness. A future. Spinning on a dance floor, the girl he loved most in his arms, finding a second home, a second family. It was everything and more. All Finn had ever wanted. Now he didn't know what he wanted. An hour after showing up on Jat unannounced, Genevieve had finally convinced him to peel himself off the floor. He barely remembered trudging up the stairs and disappearing into the loft. Forcing himself to do a series of small yet necessary tasks. Boots and armor off. Sweaty shirt off. Wash face. The cold water had cleared his head momentarily, but only just. He didn't know where to go from here and he'd left his family behind. At least Genevieve was safe. When he'd seen that curl lying in the bottom of the box containing possibly the last thing they'd ever see of his mother's, he couldn't breathe. All that mattered was getting to Jat, to make sure Genevieve was safe. Of course, Eric might have been right. It might have been a ploy to split them up. He barely remembered most of the voyage to Jat, the ocean and sky flashing past them in a blur. Helga reported nothing amiss, however, so he was ultimately glad she'd come along. To keep him on track, keep him safe. He'd have to gift her a bottle of wine or something. Once all this was over. Finn stared at the specks of dust that swirled through the air, dancing among the flower petals of a blooming azalea on the windowsill. Gobber had gifted it to Molly on her last birthday. All around the Sullivan house were signs of Burke. A wine keg in the pantry with Gobber's brand, leather riding gear from Eric and Cliff's shop hanging on a hook, a jar of toothless scales sitting on a shelf beside some seashells and books, adding to the apparent decoration that Molly was looking for. And boxes. The last few piles of boxes of Genevieve's belongings, now shoved into a far corner. Out of sight, out of mind, she'd said firmly. But they weren't out of sight, were they? Certainly not physically, let alone emotionally. After all, tomorrow was supposed to be their wedding day. And now he didn't know what to think. The wood panels of the ceiling creaked, signifying footsteps. Finn didn't move, only listened as a pair of feet came down the stairs. They were soft, gentle steps, trying not to make any noise but making noise regardless. Always caring for those she loved most. He'd know the sound of those footsteps anywhere. Moments later, Genevieve, wrapped in a robe, slipped into a seat beside him. Good morning. Finn gave her a wan smile. Please tell me you weren't down here all night. Genevieve said, pushing a few fingers through his hair. He shook his head. No, I came down a little bit ago. They fell into a long silence so quiet he could feel his own heartbeat. Genevieve opened her mouth to speak, but he beat her to it. How did we plan for something for years for it to make no difference at all? Finn looked down at his hands in his lap. How did we screw up so badly? Sometimes no matter how much we plan, life takes us a different way. But this isn't just life, Jenny. This is. Finn rubbed his eyes, unable to think of the word. We should have seen this coming. And with Ally probing a few weeks ago, sending letters to my dad about. One thing at a time. Genevieve said calmly, leaning forward. If we hope to fix this, to stay on top of everything that needs to be done in the coming hours and days, then we must prioritize. And that means going back to Burke. Finn nodded. Yes, there was no question about that. It means helping Hiccup in whatever way we can. Genevieve added. He'll need to delegate things, perhaps even more so because he'll be stressed. Distracted. Finn sighed, finally meeting her eyes. He reached up and tugged on a long curl. For a wild moment, I thought he had you. Empathy filled Genevieve's eyes. I know. I've felt terror before. Eric's leg. Benin. But nothing like that. Genevieve took his hand in both of hers and kissed it firmly. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Finn wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe her, with every fiber of his being. But his eyes still burned all the same as he said, everyone is expendable in war, Jenny. Nobody can promise that. War isn't upon us yet. Genevieve whispered. Standing, she slid one leg over his hips and straddled his lap, setting her hands on his shoulders. He sucked in a surprised breath, setting his hands on her waist. For the first time in hours he felt awake, the haze lifting from his brain, forcing him to focus. He cleared his throat. Cruel, wicked thing. Genevieve grinned and nuzzled her nose against his, her hair tickling his face. Remember our promises to each other. Remember what we said, what we decided. Her dark eyes were filled with determination now. We knew that something would happen someday. We knew that Brandine wouldn't just let it all go and disappear. And we knew there would be consequences for our choices, from the convocation until now. Because we knew this, we made promises to each other. What were they? Finn exhaled, trying not to get lost in the sensation of her soft curves pressed up, everywhere. Stay true to each other and what we stand for. Protect the weak. Do not yield. Yes. And, what else? You're forgetting one very important one. Genevieve tilted her head, leadingly. Finn glanced down at the expanse of her throat, noticing the leather strap of a familiar necklace disappearing into the folds of material. Fortis. Be strong. Yes. Not in physical might but in standing up for what is right. Genevieve said, her breath quickening slightly as he slid a hand up her leg. Not fearing what might happen, even if it's losing each other. Finn closed his eyes and shook his head. I don't know if I can do that. There are more important things than me. Genevieve said firmly. And there are more important things than you. Hey, look at me. She paused and waited for him to meet her eyes. If push comes to shove, we have to be willing to stake our claim, and if that means losing even the most precious thing to us, but it leads to victory, will it not have been worth it? Yes. And no. To have come so far in life to find the one he treasured above all, to make her expendable, it would surely kill him. Suddenly he knew exactly what his dad felt like. He wondered if his parents had ever had these conversations. If his dad ever was given the impossible choice between dragons and his family, what would he choose? Stand by his morals and sacrifice his loved ones? Or sacrifice his morals for his loved ones? An impossible choice. I guess, Finn said, his voice hoarse. It all depends on what you value most. What you love more. Your beliefs or, whatever is most important to you. Genevieve smiled, brushing his hair back so her fingers brushed the scar under his hairline. I'd say it's the principle of the thing. If the time comes, I know you will make the right choice. Well, Finn said with a melodramatic sigh. I suppose there's no hope of survival for me then. Clearly you'd choose your values over me in a heartbeat. Genevieve gaped and lightly slapped his shoulders. As if the choice would be any less difficult. Or that you would have any less value for that matter. It's okay, Jen, I get it. I'm expendable. Finn said, glancing down again at the leather cord resting on the gentle slope of her collarbone. I guess one can't have everything. Genevieve rolled her eyes. Are all haddocks always so melodramatic? She broke off into a sharp inhale as Finn set his mouth on the soft space beneath her jaw. Her hands tightened on his shoulders and she bent her neck to give him more access, breathing roughly in his ear as he mouthed the skin of her neck, moving down, down, down. Moaning deep in her throat, Genevieve shoved her hands deep into his hair and pulled him closer, pulling at the ties of the rope around her waist and yanking it open. Finn briefly saw she was wearing a silk sleeping top of sorts, soft and thoroughly enticing. He slid his hands up her back, reveling in the way she arched into him as he made a trail of kisses down the strap of his necklace. Finally he found the Fortis charm and took it in his teeth, raising his face toward hers and grinning slightly. Genevieve was shaking and breathing hard. You rogue. Grinning, he let the charm go just in time before her lips crashed onto his. She licked the seam of his mouth and he opened for her, allowing her to ravish him in whatever way she pleased. It was a struggle to stay quiet, especially with their roving hands and the way she had him pinned in the chair, but he almost didn't care. That is, until she arched at one point that a feeling like lightning shot through him and he reacted. The chair legs moved across the wood floor in a sudden sharp screech that echoed through the house. They pulled apart quickly, trying to steady their breath so they could hear if anyone in the house was approaching. It was a tense minute, but slowly they relaxed. Biting his lip at the adorable expression of mixed fear and relief on Genevieve's face, he set a kiss to her neck again. Finn. Genevieve breathed, pulling away and setting a finger on his lips with a prim yet amused expression. We should probably stop. He sighed. Probably. Otherwise, well, we probably won't stop, and honestly this isn't the best place. Yeah, but... Nah, you're right. Genevieve frowned. No, tell me. You can say what you're thinking. Finn gazed up at her, her golden hair haloed in the golden sunlight now streaming through the window. The skin of her neck was red from kisses and he pushed down a satisfied smirk. We don't know what's going to happen now, do we? The wedding is postponed. Who knows what will happen next? So? Genevieve raised a brow, a small grin lighting her face. You want to find a barn or something? Gods, woman. No. Finn said, ignoring her laugh. Sitting up he gathered her into his arms and looked into her eyes. I've already promised you this, we will do this properly, especially since we've put in all the time at this rate, and when the time comes, it will be worth the wait. Genevieve nodded. I know. And? I'm sorry. For what? Postponing it. It made sense to, but... Finn shrugged. Well, tomorrow was supposed to be our wedding day. Genevieve gave him a smile and then a firm kiss. Don't be. Our time will come. Finn felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. He loved her so much it nearly hurt. Still, you're a temptation that's hard to ignore and you don't make it easy. Well, Genevieve said, slowly drawing the robe back up over her shoulders and slowly tying it so that her entire upper body was once more hidden. I aim to please. HMPH. And besides, Finn said, glancing toward the rest of the house and leaning closer. It might be a little awkward if your family wakes up and finds us in ill repose. Genevieve choked on a laugh. Ill repose. That's not even remotely what that means. I know, that's why it's funny. It's a play on words. Much more amusing than puns. She sighed and promptly stood. You're ridiculous. I'm ridiculous. Have you heard Cliff's naughty puns regarding? No, and I don't want to. Genevieve said as she sashayed away, though her nose was crinkled in that adorable way that meant she was fighting a smile. Finn grinned as she began filling a kettle to make tea. Down the hall he could hear signs of movement, which meant that people were indeed starting to waken. To start the day. He let out a long breath, realizing that meant making plans. The night before, Ivan had sent a letter to Burke letting them know that Finn and Helga had arrived safely. He also stated that he would begin gathering the Jatan forces to aid the archipelago. They'd probably go to Burke first to then decide where to go first. Finn had no idea where they'd go. They still knew so little, and now with Astrid gone, they'd need to plan their next steps very carefully. He was lost in thought as Kiev and Molly entered the room. Kiev was already dressed in leather and armor fit for a chieftain, though he'd been retired for some years now. Molly was also surprisingly dressed in a leather jerkin over her navy wool dress. At Finn's surprised look, she merely said, "Even the womenfolk have a place in battle." "Shield Maiden Molly," Finn said, fighting a smile. "Who knew?" She batted a hand in his direction as she bustled to the kitchen to help Genevieve, who was messily scrambling eggs. "Odin's beard, girl, what have you done?" "Just trying to start the day off right." "Yes, but look at the state of my kitchen. I've only been up 5 minutes." While the women bickered, thankfully with a playful air, Kiev took a seat next to Finn and leaned closer. "She helps the healers prepare materials at times like this." Finn nodded. He opened his mouth to reply when footsteps sounded on the porch before the door flew open. It was Helga and Thuggery, both flushed. Finn briefly wondered if they'd been running or flying, as they used to do, or arguing for the tense looks on their faces. Molly's voice broke the brief silence before anyone could speak. "Why is it so difficult for Burkians to knock?" "We have a situation," Thuggery said, his dark eyes urgent. Finn and Kiev jumped to their feet. "What?" Helga grabbed Finn by the arm and gestured for the women to follow. "Come see for yourself." Everyone followed the pair outside. Already Jatans were gathering outside by the dozens, the men on their way to work paused in the street or running back inside to wake their families. They were shouting and pointing out at sea in confusion and dismay. Finn pushed through the crowd, terrified for a moment that another box had been sent. But no, there wasn't anything of that sort, and that wouldn't make sense considering all the witnesses. He found Ivan standing at the edge of the cliff, his arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. "Ivan, what's wrong?" Ivan's dark eyes were dark with fury. "You mean you don't see it?" Beside him, Genevieve gasped. Finn turned, scanning the ocean to see a series of black dots on the horizon. As far as the eye could see from north to south in a single file line. It didn't seem to be coming closer, but instead, waiting. Or perhaps, even worse, to keep anyone from going in or out. A blockade. Kiev muttered a curse under his breath. Finn ran a hand over his face and swore. "Well, now what?" The silence in Hiccup's office was deafening, aside from Toothless' deep breaths coming in steady heaves beside his chair. In and out. In and out. In and out. Hiccup was grateful for that at least. It was soothing and familiar and was a tether that kept him rooted to earth. Toothless' soft nose poked his shoulder. Deep down Hiccup tried to acknowledge the low questioning rumble that accompanied the velvety soft nudge, and yet he didn't know what to say. What to do? What to think? "Your right arm is mine. My only regret is that I'm not there to see you bleed." Astrid. His right arm, his best friend, his closest companion since they were teenagers, gone. No, not gone. Captured, yes. Gone from him now, yes, but not for long. Astrid wouldn't give in without a fight. A thought that should have brought him pride and strength, to know that wherever she was, whatever was being done to her, she'd never give up. Except the all-petrifying thought that kept circling his mind ever since the box had arrived was that he'd once again failed and he hadn't been there to help her. Never mind the fact that Astrid was more stubborn than he was and constantly went on reconnaissance trips alone, despite the protocols. Despite the fact that it wasn't smart, and for exactly this reason. Because if something happened, there was backup right there to either help or go get help. It didn't matter, and, for the same exact reason that he'd stopped entertaining the idea of forcing the kids to have guards, he'd gone along with it. Stopped pestering all of them and himself with the idea. Because at the end of the day, he was a control freak. A paranoid, obsessed control freak. He had to learn to let go, to trust them. To trust that Astrid, Finn, Eric and even Addie could protect themselves. But Darin. His grandson's name alone seemed to pull him from the depths of his mind. Slowly Hiccup raised his head, his fingers running down his face. He glanced around his desk littered with papers and writing utensils and shelves of various tonics of dragon poisons and anecdotes, listening to the creak of the floorboards overhead. He barely remembered coming down to his office beneath the hatchery, somehow finding solace beneath a den of dragons and Heathen at home. To go home meant to see everything he and Astrid had built together. At least, the intimate side of their relationship, from the house they'd built to the dishes in the cabinets to the furniture to the knickknacks on the shelves. Mementos from their years together as teenagers and young adults, parents, and now grandparents. He couldn't go home to that and risk falling to pieces. Not that he was doing much better here, but after Finn had fled to Jut, which he shouldn't have allowed but was barely present for, and the council had been in an uproar, he'd needed some place quiet to settle. To cope and grieve for a time. But now he wasn't sure how long he'd been down here, alone with his thoughts and his dragon. Now he needed to pull himself together. Toothless poked his shoulder again with his nose and this time Hiccup met his eyes, feeling drained. The Night Fury's eyes glowed in the dimness of the office, despite the spots of sunlight that streamed through the windows across the room. Sunlight. That meant he'd been down here for hours. All night in fact. Hiccup reached up and stroked the soft scales above Toothless' eyes. His dragon purred. "What do I do, bud? Where do I start?" Toothless crooned, flattening his hand against his broad forehead. A sudden yet soft knock sounded against the door across the room. Sighing, Hiccup stood, straightening his shirt and combing his fingers through his hair. He hoped he didn't look as bad as he felt, but there was no point in hiding the obvious. He felt horrible and probably looked horrible. He crossed the room with even, unhurried steps, mentally preparing for whoever was on the other side of the door. Probably Gobber. He hoped it wasn't Snotlout or the twins. The knock hadn't been particularly loud though and wasn't followed by any shouting or scuffling. Fish legs probably. Exhaling, he swung the door open and blinked to see Eric standing there, wearing a long-sleeved forest green shirt and leather jerkin. His Jatanbo and quiver were strapped to his back, his daggers at his belt. And over his forearms and hands covering his knuckles were leather gloves. The trousers were loose-fitting and the right leg was tucked into a fitted knee-high leather boot with grips on the toes and heel, which would provide him extra stability when running, climbing and more. Eric had been thoroughly excited when he'd designed them the last few months and he'd surely be grateful for them now. Hiccup had never seen him decked out in full armor before and the sight nearly took him aback. Nonplussed, Eric stuck out a rather large coffee and a paper bag with what appeared to be a bagel inside. "I thought you might need a pick-me-up." Despite himself, Hiccup smiled and nodded. "Thanks." He took them and nodded his son-in-law inside before swinging the door closed with his prosthetic. "What's with the get-up?" Eric raised a brow. "I should think that was obvious." Hiccup nearly burned his throat on the coffee and forced himself to blow on it. "So everyone knows." The council gathered everyone at dawn and told them to prepare. "Everyone's in armor now." Nodding, Hiccup dropped into his chair. "I'm sorry I checked out." "Hiccup, don't," Eric said firmly, drawing his gaze away from a nearby bookshelf containing volumes on poisons and antidotes. If it was any hell, if it was anyone's spouse, they would fall apart a bit, too. "Don't apologize for that." Nodding again, Hiccup forced himself to take a bite of the bagel. Though the blueberries were oozing purple juice and it had likely been made fresh that morning, he could barely taste it. "I honestly don't know where to start." He paused, forcing another sip of coffee down. "Jade and Yui, hopefully Leaf is alright. And with Millie missing and Kara attacked." Eric held up his hands. "I know. Even though we're allies though, we've got enough on our plate here. We have to prioritize. So what would you suggest?" "Well, as chief you get the final say. We got a letter from Ivan saying Finn and Helga made it, by the way. He'll bring his armada and riders here as soon as he can so we can make a real plan." The coffee in Hiccup's hands steamed in the air between them. "Would you send anyone to Berserker? To look for survivors?" Eric pursed his lips and slowly shook his head. "I'm sure Berserker is entirely Brandine's by now. The real question is, do you want to send the armies to Berserker? Take the fight to him?" Hiccup took a deep breath. "It's a possibility. The problem is we don't know how many men he has. It might be wiser to wait for Jet. True. If Sven was willing to go through with his backup plan, then it has to be many. Otherwise he wouldn't make such a statement. And Brandine wouldn't go through with any of this unless he thought he could win. Right. Eric tapped his prosthetic on the ground, clearly agitated. Toothless glanced between them and yawned, claws scraping against the stones with nail-biting screeches. Hiccup jabbed him with his prosthetic. Stop that, bud. We're trying to think. Toothless sniffed and stole the rest of his bagel. Hey. You know, bud, you really know how to kick a wounded man already down. Eric shook his head with an amused smirk. What? Who steals a man's bagel? Apparently hungry dragons. Toothless licked his lips in a self-satisfied way that earned him another grin. The amusement was short-lived however. How's Addie? Hiccup asked before finishing the coffee. Eric was quiet. Worried. She's doing all right, all things considered. Watching Darin like a hawk though, which is partially why I'm here. Hiccup raised a brow. Oh. She wanted some alone time with him. Anyone else might not have thought twice about the words, but Hiccup knew them well. He knew they'd gone through a rough patch a few weeks ago. Things seemed to have gotten better, and yet. Are you guys okay? Hiccup asked, some fatherly instinct returning to his voice. Clearing the haze a bit, though that may have also been the coffee. Eric glanced over, surprised. Yeah. Yeah, we're good. It's just. He paused. She wants to fight. Hiccup blinked. He hadn't expected that. Well, she has been training. Yes, but Darin needs her. Darin needs both of you. Why should she risk her life? Eric asked, sounding more agitated now. Hiccup realized then what was wrong. Of all people, Addie has the right to fight. Whether it's for herself or for her people, she wants to do her part. I know that. But to drop Darin off at either Loffin's or my mother's doesn't feel right, nor do I want her going off into battle where I can't. Eric broke off as if remembering who he was talking to. Who was missing. He closed his eyes and looked away. I know. Hiccup said quietly. Trust me, this is exactly the reason I always wanted each of you doing missions with at least one person. I've had to learn to trust everyone and let go even if it takes risks, and now look. I lost an entire night fretting over Astrid because I don't know. His breath caught and he looked away. Because I don't know if she's even alive. That is why it scares me. Eric said. Because I can imagine. And selfishly, I don't want to go through that. I don't want to have to tell Darin his mommy isn't coming home because he won't understand. Hiccup felt positively drained. You, and every other person on this island. Just be glad you don't have to send them to their deaths like I do. A flash of fear entered Eric's eyes then and he looked away. Gods forbid something happens to you and Finn and Annie. Or I might. Hiccup closed his eyes and sighed, forcing the thought away. If that should happen. No. That wasn't going to happen. He wasn't dead yet and until proven otherwise, Astrid wasn't either. Finn was coming home soon with backup from Jet on the way. Some of his friends were gone, yes, but that didn't mean those villages weren't now scrambling to help. Surely letters had been sent from all the villages to each other, not just to him, so they'd know of Sven's sacrifice. They'd know Brandine was here. They'd be getting their armies ready and begin sailing and flying to the heart of the archipelago, where they'd gather to meet Brandine's army head-on. Which meant he needed to stop sitting around feeling sorry for himself and get to work. As if reading his thoughts, Toothless growled eagerly and hopped to his feet. Eric seemed to sense it, too. So, where do we start? Hiccup got to his feet and walked to a nearby chest. He lifted his leg and flicked open the compartment on his prosthetic. Fumbling through a few papers he kept stored inside, mainly passcodes that he never wanted to forget for various locked items around the island, he finally drew out a small black key. Sealing the compartment again and dropping to his knees, he unlocked the chest and lifted open the heavy lid with both palms, which groaned from years of disuse. Eric and Toothless peered over his shoulders at the swaths of black material. What is that? Hiccup smirked. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. Clearly curious, Eric begrudgingly turned away and began for the stairs. He'd just made it to the door when Hiccup suddenly remembered something. A safety net, a precaution, just in case the worst should happen. Wait, Eric. His son-in-law paused at the door and turned around, a questioning look on his face. Hiccup pulled his desk chair away from the desk and got to his knees. From a small shelf he'd built in the back corner, he withdrew a key and held it up to Eric. This will open a box buried in my backyard by the white oak. Inside is a black tail for Toothless, in case the one he's wearing now gets destroyed. Eric nodded as he took the key and put inside a small pouch at his hip. Why not put it on now? Because it's a spare and this tail allows me to fly him. That tail won't need all the gear. Anyone can ride him and he'll be able to control the tail himself. But, why wouldn't you put that on him all the time? Hiccup looked up at Toothless with a smile before stroking his nose. Because he doesn't want it. So it's only for emergencies. Tell Addie and Finn when he gets back. Genevieve too, I'm sure she's coming back with him. But no one else. Eric nodded. Hopefully we won't need it. Still, it doesn't hurt to be prepared. After all, Hiccup said, steering his son-in-law out the door with a grin. Even you destroyed that tail once. Do you have to bring that up? Hiccup pushed him toward the stairs with a short laugh. I'll see you in a few minutes. Nodding, Eric took the stairs 3 at a time and disappeared. Hiccup shut the door and locked it before striding back to the chest. Well, Bud. What do you say we remind the archipelago of darker days? The Burkian villagers were all abuzz. Their chiefess was missing. Rumors of dead chieftains spread like wildfire, lighting up the lower town. Finn was gone, fled to Jut in a panic. Adriana was withdrawn and holding tightly to her son, raising her chin to anyone who looked too closely. Men and women alike gathered their battle armor, heeding the call of the council that war was approaching. Food and medical supplies were gathered in abundance in the great hall where any wounded would be taken. Young Vidar Jorgensen and Gobber were joined by many old hands who knew metal work as weapons were sharpened and shields repaired. Cliff Smedley was joined by Grandma Ingerman and Morgan and a few others proficient at needlepoint to repair leatherwork and saddles and other gear that would be vital to riding in battle. Despite the sense of urgency, there was no panic. The people worked in tandem as if they'd prepared for war before. Which, the younger folk soon realized, the elder generations had. The only one that seemed to be missing in action was the chief himself. Nobody had seen him at the meeting with the council. Nobody had seen him even the night before. Toothless also seemed to be missing in action, which no doubt meant he was surely at his master's side. It seemed to some that the chief had withdrawn into himself, perhaps losing his mind at last now that this final nail had driven home. Perhaps he couldn't handle the thought of losing his beloved wife, the whispers said. Perhaps the fear had truly begun to drive him mad. But where was fearless Finn? He, too, had fled. And Adriana was strong in her own right, but would she lead them into battle? Eyes rolled and voices scoffed. Yes, they prepared and they worked to be ready to defend their homeland. But still they doubted. Cliff had put a stop to such whispers every time he heard them. Thoughts of Alton had plagued him for days now, though he tried to keep his spirits up. But now with Astrid missing and Finn gone, he knew that the last thing Burke needed was to doubt their chieftain. Even if he had been missing for countless hours. He refused to believe that Hiccup was falling to pieces. If Tarin had been taken, he'd want some alone time to think, too. Even Eric had said as much when they met at the shop at dawn, scarfing breakfast before the day began. Tarin was at home resting, though she'd had many complaints on the matter. She wanted to help and do her part, just as all the women were doing. There was no reason why she couldn't sit in a chair beside him and sew things together, just as he was. And yet he was glad he'd put his foot down, for the baby's sake. With the hubbub of gossip and stress beginning to rise with the morning sun, he didn't want her taking on any extra stress. After all, she was due to have their baby soon. According to Inga, who'd checked in that morning as well, any day now. They'd found out she was pregnant in November, and she'd admitted to feeling sick 4 weeks prior, which of course had prompted her visit to the healers. Now it was almost July. The 9th month term was up. So, he'd said in a firm voice he almost never used with anyone, much less his wife. Taryn was staying home. Taryn had begrudgingly agreed, but demanded that he come home every few hours to bring her news or she'd come and find him. Knowing she'd do it, too, he had agreed. Cliff realized belatedly that it had been almost 2 hours since his last visit home, so he'd probably need to make the trip soon. Never mind the fact that they were supremely busy. Grandma Ingerman seemed to notice his plight as he glanced up at the sun and then at the long line. "Go to her, dear. The line will still be here when you return." Cliff sighed and handed off the finished product to the customer in line. "All right, thanks. I'll be back as soon as I can." "Be careful, Cliffy," Morgan said, glancing up from the needle briefly as he walked by. "Send Evan my way if you see him." Cliff nodded and exited the shop through the back, pushing through the heavily crowded streets. The streets of Burke were always bustling, but now that everyone who lived here was on the streets, the congestion was insurmountable. He wished that he'd brought Edna Louise Sacramento III, but it would have been tedious to keep her waiting outside the shop. The roof wasn't quite sturdy enough for her weight, so he couldn't ask her to stay up there. Well, he'd just have to. A body plowed into him and he stumbled, catching himself on a stranger's arm. "Sorry," Cliff said, both to the man he'd grabbed and the person who ran into him, though it was hardly his fault. It was Inga. She looked frazzled, her black hair braided back as usual, but her blue eyes were dark with irritation. "Sorry, you okay?" "Yeah, I'm all right. Off to check on Taryn." Inga nodded distractedly, rummaging through her basket to make sure she hadn't dropped anything. "I've been a hot mess all morning, plowing into people worse than a water buffalo." "Water buffaloes make excellent swimmers," Cliff said, then frowned. Why must he always spew random information? Now was not the time. Surprisingly, Inga cracked a smile. "Yes, you've told me before." "Oh. Sorry." Inga looked up. "Oh no, it's fine. Are you okay?" "Yeah," Cliff said, glancing around. "I guess I'm just feeling a bit out of my element right now." "Yeah, we've never had to go through something like this before." Inga straightened then and added, "But it'll be fine." "I'll wager," she trailed off, her eyes catching on something over his shoulder. Cliff raised a brow. "You'd wager what?" "I'd wager Brandine's going to get his war," Inga said in a suddenly awed voice and grinned. "Turn around." Cliff did and saw what she was staring at. His mouth fell open. Striding from the hatchery were Hiccup and Toothless like he'd never seen them before. Dressed head to toe in black Night Fury scale armor, they stepped into the sunlight. A metal cylinder was clipped to his left hip, which held a series of buttons that only spoke of UN Viking-like weaponry. Though no one had seen them in hours, there was no indication that Hiccup had lost his marbles. Quite the opposite in fact. With matching sets of blazing green eyes, Hiccup and Toothless looked ready for war. The whispers died as the crowd parted, letting them through. Hiccup kept his chin high, not meeting the open-mouthed stares of his people, or noticing that people began to follow them. There was Snotlout Jorgensen, Roughnout and Toughnout Thorsten, Fishlegs Ingerman, Gobber and Spitaloot and more. Every council member followed their chieftain and his dragon through the streets toward the Great Hall. A hand grabbed Cliff's arm and he tore his eyes away to see Eric standing there, looking just as shocked. "I guess if Hiccup broke out the real armor then this means war then, huh?" Cliff grinned and looked back, feeling strengthened for the first time in what felt like days. Brandine won't know what hit him. It's probably a little shameful to admit, Inga added, looking positively roguish. But I've always wanted to see the Chief and Toothless kick some butt. It was a rush of activity. Ivan had called for ships and riders to prepare for battle almost before the sun had fully risen. Finn had seen Jet in the rush of battle, but that had been harried and unorganized chaos. This was strategic preparation for organized battle. This was a sure and solid plan to send ships into the sea and riders into the sky with the expectation that men would fight and fall in battle, all for Jet's borders. And, Finn knew, to give them a chance to break through the blockade. Because he couldn't stay here. He had to get back to Burke to help his dad. No doubt he was tearing his hair out with worry by now. Still, he'd fought in battles and duels. As Toughnout used to always say, This ain't my first rodeo, whatever the hell that meant. But it was no small thing what they were trying to do. To break a blockade. Not for the first time that morning, he felt his stomach drop. He had to trust Ivan. He had his duty to protect his home and people, and that meant breaking the blockade. Getting to Berk was secondary now. And Finn's primary duty was to get home. If he had any other choice, he'd stay and help them fight. A fact that each of the Sullivan men had thoroughly waved off. It was bad enough, he thought, that Thuggery was coming back to Berk with them. In his opinion, he belonged here, helping his brothers. But much to his surprise, they almost insisted that Thuggery go. He'll be a valuable asset and representative of Jet on our behalf, Ivan said. Besides, he'll help protect you and Jen and Helga on the way back. We don't need protection, Finn argued. We need to just break through. The less people we have, the easier you will be to capture, Ivan said firmly. That blockade will surely have dozens upon dozens of riders ready to capture you, and you, especially, cannot be captured. No doubt they knew you'd be here. It's exactly the sort of thing Brandine would expect, especially after sending someone out here to steal a lock of Genevieve's hair. Why else would? I know, Ivan. I know. Finn huffed, rubbing his eyes. I just don't know honestly how we're going to get through without at least one of us getting captured. Even if we fly as high as we can, we'll still be followed. If they want me that badly, they'll follow us as far as they need to. Genevieve, who'd been sitting silently at the kitchen table where a large map had been set with decorated salt and pepper shakers holding the corners and dried beans used to show the blockade, spoke up. What if we go under it? They all paused, looking at her. Max and Zap are shock jaws. They could do it. Finn winced. But Jenny, we'd have to hold our breath for a long time. And Thuggery and Helga's dragons are nadders, they can't go under. And to send them over the blockade alone would surely get them captured. Then use Pepper and Thunder, Genevieve said. The nadders will have to stay and they'll rejoin us on Berk when they break through the blockade. The room had gone entirely silent while everyone looked to Helga and Thuggery chewed on this idea. Thuggery looked like he was chewing on a piece of dough, but he finally looked at Helga, waiting for her decision. Things had been tenuous between them at best. Helga had barely looked at him, let alone spoken to him. Finn wanted to say something, but knew that he had more important things to be dealing with right now than his best friend's love life. Still, seeing Thuggery looked so dejected was rather painful. Finally, Helga shrugged. Fine. But Shade won't like it. Shade will have to, Finn said. His only other option is to get captured or even die. Helga nodded and marched to the door. Better tell him the bad news then. A moment later she was gone. Thuggery's face flushed a rosy pink. This is ridiculous. Ivan shrugged. Sorry. No, not that. The fact that she can hardly stand to look at me. The room became uncomfortably quiet. Where's Thunder? Thuggery asked. Playing in the river, Genevieve said quietly. Nodding, Thuggery strode out of the house. Finn let out a breath and shook his head. If he's coming, they are going to have to get a grip. Ivan pursed his lips and slapped his arm. That's your job, not mine. To the room at large, he said, I'm going to the hall. I need to check in with the council to make sure things are coming along. Kiev and Molly nodded, but Genevieve only had eyes for Finn. When do you want to leave? Finn took a deep breath and shook his head. The sooner the better, but it might be better if we leave when the Jatan ships meet the blockade. I don't want to sit around and wait, but if we go alone, they'll see us go under. We can't hold our breath from here to the blockade, let alone beyond it. Genevieve nodded and stood. I'll get myself ready then. However, I might need help rummaging through boxes, Mother. I'm not sure where my riding gear is. Molly followed her to the corner where some boxes were. Finn tuned out their muttering, hoping that the gear would be in one of these and not on the ship that was supposed to take her things to Berk today. Finn shoved the thought of their postponed wedding aside. There was no use for that line of thinking, let alone time. One thing he needed to make priority though was his best friend. I'll be back, Genevieve popped up from a box. Be safe. I'm just looking for Helga. She winced. All the same, be safe. She might shove you off the cliff. Finn grinned. I think the worst we'll have is bruised foreheads, but we'll manage. Her laugh was lost as he shut the door behind him. He moved through the crowded street in search of Helga. Predictably he found her outside the blacksmith's. Shade loved to sit among the soot and hot coals of the forge on Burke. It came as no surprise that he'd set up a roost outside the Jatan forge, too. Helga was talking to him in a prim voice. Now don't take that tone with me. If I had any other choice, you'd be coming back with me. But as it is, I like you in one piece and not pieces. So until the Jatans break the blockade, you have to stay here. As soon as you're in the clear you can come home and find me. Okay. Shade squawked, angling his head to look at Finn out of the corner of his eye. Don't look at me, he said quickly. It wasn't my idea. No, but it is the smartest one we have. Helga scratched her dragon's orange-brown scales with a begrudging smile. You can give Pepper hell later, but for now it is what it is. Shade huffed, the spines on his tail lowering at last. Good boy. Helga patted his nose. She turned to Finn with raised brows, noting with a flick of her blue eyes that his arms were crossed. So when are we leaving? I think the smartest time is when the fight starts. The armies will be distracted. But that's not what I want to talk about. Finn sighed. Whether you like it or not, Thugger is coming to Burke with us. I know. So you might need to stop giving him the cold shoulder. Helga glared. Just like you to butt your head into my business. Stay out of it, Finn. I can't. Finn said, trying to force his temper down. It wasn't helpful to get frustrated. I'm counting on you and him to keep each other safe, to keep me and Jen safe. If you two can't even look at each other. He's the one who won't quit with the puppy eyes. You're not exactly making it easy on him. Finn said, then exhaled a heavy breath. Look, if it was any other day, nothing crazy happening, I would stay out of it. When have I ever stuck my nose in your business like this? Helga wouldn't meet his eye. Instead she was glaring at the ocean, toward the blockade. So what do you want me to do? Talk to him, for starters. I need both of you to focus, and if you can't do that, then you're both staying here. I'll take someone else. Helga's eyes flashed. Don't you dare. I'm not staying here, I only came because of you. I didn't come for him. That's beside the point because he is coming back with us, whether you like it or not. So I'm asking you, Finn broke off. No, I'm ordering you to talk to him. What the hell do you want me to say? Whatever it takes for you two to get your heads on straight, so we don't get shot out of the sky or drown. Can you do that? Helga shook her head. You're not making this easy or being fair. Fair? Finn demanded. My mother is missing, Helga. How the hell is that fair? She flinched, stunned into silence. Alton is missing. Finn continued. Inga may never see him again. Explain to me how that is fair. Helga said nothing. Finn took a deep breath through his nose and let it out. I'm not telling you to make up or make false promises. But I need you. Who do you think those men on those ships and dragons want the most right now? He jerked his jaw toward the distant line of ships. You said it yourself. You came because of me. Because you knew I was not thinking straight and I was being impulsive, and I easily could have been captured. I don't want to sound selfish, but I can't afford to get captured. I don't want to put Genevieve in danger. Not if I can't trust you or her brother to get a freaking grip. I'll talk to him. Helga whispered. You're right. It's not about us and this awkward situation. We need to put it aside and focus. She sighed. You're right, I'm sorry. Finn's anger filtered away. It had been fueled by stress anyway, but yelling at his best friend didn't make him feel any better. Don't apologize. Believe me, if none of this was happening, I'd leave it alone. And I didn't get a chance to thank you for coming, but I do appreciate it. Helga waved a hand. Someone has to keep you on track when Jen's not around. Finn grinned. Right. But, while we're on the topic. He paused, uncertain. Oh, go on. Helga sighed, though not irritably. Just say it. I just don't get it. I can understand the fear of the unknown or commitment, Finn said. But Thugger is a great guy. You balance each other out. So why? Helga chewed on her lip for so long, he thought she wouldn't reply. And then for the same reason I never initiated things again with you. Finn frowned, confused. Well, that was an entirely different set of circumstances, considering I was an abusive jerk. At least I hope Thug isn't harboring a bad personality underneath, but 1, you'd beat him to a pulp, and 2, something tells me he's not that good of a liar. You're right on both counts. Helga sighed. No, I mean. I always thought you deserved better. After you came home and started to get better, I mean. And you got what you needed in the end. Genevieve soothes those hard edges you try to hide. Finn felt an odd softness and sadness at her words and their implication. And thuggery. Helga shook her head and shrugged. He could do better. No, I don't think he can. Her blue eyes met his at last and they were vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen in years. You don't think he could do better than the brash girl from Burke? Finn choked on a sudden laugh. Are you kidding me? More than half the guys on this island wanted to date you within 2 days of being here. Well yeah, I'm an impressive specimen. That's my Helga. Finn sighed, earning himself a grin at last. I mean, I'm not impressed that they're easily impressed. Yeah, but a guy who's legitimately awesome and not shallow in the least bit isn't allowed to be impressed. You liked that he was impressed, which is the whole reason you allowed it. Yes, I allowed it, but, more, the future, that's. Helga shook her head. That's different. It is different. But I don't think he was being flippant when he asked you to marry him. I don't think he would have asked you if he wasn't set on it. Finn said. And now he probably doesn't know where to go or what to do because things were probably great and then you cut him off, like, well, I don't know. But if it was me, I'd wonder if you ever cared. If you were just playing a game. Helga stared up at him. What? No. Not at all. He caught me off guard, that's all. Finn sighed. Why do we both overreact when we're caught off guard? Part of our natural charm, I guess. The words were meant to be joking but there was little humor in her voice. Gods, I feel rather stupid now. Don't feel stupid. Just talk to him. For what it's worth, you deserve to be happy too, Helga. Whatever that means. Just don't run from something that could be good for you because you don't think you're good enough. You are good enough. Finn was quiet for a moment. I'd hate for you to have regrets, if the worst should happen. We don't know what's going to happen next. Her eyes went strangely bright and she nodded. I'll think about it. I mean, I will talk to him about putting our stuff aside for now, because you're right. We have to focus and they're two very different situations. Right. Plus you need to find Pepper. I don't know how much time we'll have and we need to be ready to leave as soon as possible. Finn glanced at the harbor, which was more crowded now that soldiers were boarding ships with weapons and shields. Do it now or save it for later, I don't care. I just need you both with me. Helga straightened and set a firm hand on his shoulder. I'm with you. No matter where we go next, I'll be there. Finn clasped her shoulder as well. Thanks. She released his arm and began to trudge away, but she quickly spun back around. And, thanks. That probably wasn't easy. Hey, my relationship advice doesn't come for free. We're getting ale as soon as all this is over. I'll mark my ledger. Laughing, Finn turned away and marched down the street. It was still bustling, but now there were long lines of men heading to the docks, their shoulders and packs heavily laden with food, medical supplies, shields, weapons, and armor. They moved with a quick efficiency that sent a thrill of excitement through his chest. I've heard rumors of this army of yours, his father had said once, back in the Great Hall upon their first meeting with Ivan and Kiev and the other Jatan delegates. Finn trained the Jatans to ride dragons and fight in the air, but now he might actually get to see them fight as an organized militarized unit on the sea, maybe even on land. He sighed and pushed the thought aside. This wasn't a book or fantasy. This was reality, and the reality was never pretty by comparison. As he pushed inside the Terra Mail office, he touched the scar on his neck from the wound Brandine had given him in the duel for Adriana's honor and future. For Darren's future. Though he'd lost the duel, it had done the job well enough. The archipelago knew of Brandine's true nature and had since prepared for whatever next moves he might make against them. It was insane to think after all this time, it was all finally happening. "Ah, Finn," the postmaster said, his grey hair sticking out from under his blue cap. His beard was set in an almost permanent downwards triangle shape, a feat Finn was sure defied all physics considering it didn't move the way normal hair did. "What can I do for you?" Finn blinked out of his stupor, transfixed by the beard as he was. "Hey Phil, I need to write a few letters." "Ah, but the chief has forbade any terrors from going out," Phil said with a sad air. Indeed, the dozens of terrible terrors lying in baskets around the room looked quite put out. "We can only hope the little one he sent last night to Burke made it through, but there's no telling. At any rate, we can't risk any messages getting intercepted." "I understand," Finn said. "However, these terrors are staying with me." Phil blinked. "As you run the blockade." "But sir." "Trust me," Finn interrupted with a smile. "Nobody understands the weight of this more than I do, but I need to write a few letters. The letters and terrors will stay with me until I'm ready to leave, and as soon as we make it through, they're off. They'll make it." And he added a little firmer. "I'm writing my messages in code." Chapter 9, Missing in Action. Chapter Text. The ships were silent as they cut through the water. The slap of water against the hull was broken only by the hushed murmurs of the Jatan warriors gathered on decks. The clink of armor and shields and weapons was a soft cacophony, mixing with the scrape of dragon scales and rustling of wings. A slight breeze was in their favor, giving the Jatan ships speed as they rode the waves into the harbor. Toward the blockade. To Burke. Finn felt a strange inner calm as he gazed at the blockade, looming closer and closer with each breath. Zap rustled beneath him, growling softly. He patted her neck and said nothing. This wasn't their first battle, though they weren't fighting. However, her nerves and eagerness would only make her faster in the water. He only hoped Thunder, Pepper and Max were equally eager. No, they were. Before joining their individual ships, he'd met each of their eyes, one by one. Even Maximum Genevieve and the others had looked on in bewilderment, but it was something he'd seen his dad do a million times. The eye contact, the unerring trust. No fear. These shockjaws, his family, would get them through the blockade. They would make it. They had to. The biggest fear lay in him and his friends holding their breath for the distance they needed to. Helga and Thuggery weren't trained in swimming like himself and Genevieve. Nor were the terrible terrors traveling with them, one on his shoulder, one on Genevieve's, and the third on Helga's. So they had quickly trained Helga and Thuggery on the Shockjaw's coded warning, which Finn had trained each of the babies on as they'd grown. 1 pat to signal that the rider was okay. 2 pats to signal that the dragon should speed up, due to losing breath. 3 pats meant to surface immediately. Thuggery had made a joke about not making any signals until he needed to surface, but Finn had quickly cut him off. Shockjaws will just keep going if you don't give them information. If you wait until the last second to tell Thunder to surface, you're already unconscious by the time he gets there, and the rest of us won't be there to get the water out of your lungs. So please, for the love of the gods, don't drown yourself. Thuggery had given him a serious nod at that. Helga had merely adjusted her weapons belt and said, "You may have a big mouth, Thug, but even you can't swallow the ocean." He'd cracked a small smile at that, but Finn hadn't stuck around to hear more. He had to find Genevieve before they were instructed to board the ships. He found her watching the loading ships with crossed arms, worrying her lower lip. Of course she was worried for her people, especially her family. He'd wanted more than anything to give her some encouragement, to say something brave that would wipe that look off her face, but knew it was futile. She was surrendering herself to leaving while everyone she'd known her entire life went to battle. She might lose people. And she wouldn't find out until hours, if not days later, if things truly went badly. So he'd merely set a hand on her shoulder and pulled her closer. Even he couldn't fix this. When Ivan had called to board the ships, she'd given him a clear, steady look. He'd swiped his thumb against her cheek and then strode to Zap, not bothering to look back. The fewer faces he saw before the battle, the less he'd wonder which of them would be still alive the next time he saw Jet. Now, some minutes later, as the ships loomed ever closer, close enough to see the image of the Skrill on each flag high above the masts, he recalled that clear, steady look on her face and exhaled slowly through his nose. It was time. Patting Zap once on the shoulder, she began to move. The soldiers had been instructed not to react when the shockjaws began their descent down the ropes toward the back of each ship. Their utmost goal was not to be seen, and if anyone made a fuss about 4 shockjaws slipping into the water from their ships, the enemy soldiers would surely notice. The shockjaws couldn't make much of a splash into the water either, or that too would draw attention. If the enemy happened to have water-class dragons of their own. Finn ignored the thought, praying they didn't. Even he couldn't fight underwater. They only had one shot at this. Finn clenched his jaw and clung on with his legs, fighting gravity as the water loomed closer and closer. Shouts and jeers rose up from the ships, sending a rush of adrenaline through his chest. Stay calm. Relax. The ship tilted slightly this way and that as dragons took off with powerful wing beats. They rose high above the ships, dozens upon dozens of riders from Jet. They were soon joined by riders from the enemy lines, rising higher and higher, ready to fly. To fight. Zap finally slipped into the water, almost soundlessly. Water flooded Finn's boots and clothes, but he didn't care. His only concern was that the coded letters he'd written, now wrapped in a protective layer of plastic that Genevieve had provided, would be safe. He wasn't sure if or when he'd have time to rewrite them later. The terrible terror on his shoulder gave a fearful squeak and clutched his armor tighter. Shush, it's okay, come here. Finn whispered. He pulled the dragon closer to his chest and leaned forward as Zap's wings spread beneath the surface, preparing them to dive. The water was now at chest level, the abyss descending far beneath him. He could only hope the others were ready, waiting for Ivan's signal just as he was. He glanced up at the ship, surveying the number of riders in the air. It was next to impossible to get a clear count from this vantage. Brandine had to have hundreds of soldiers here, and this only one portion of his army. A few Jatan soldiers were gazing down at him from the edge of the ship. They quickly averted their eyes, a flash of nervousness on their faces. Not for the coming battle, but likely the concept of watching him descend into the watery depths below with nothing keeping him alive except a single breath of air. He'd done this a million times. It shouldn't be any different, but it was. Even he had never swam with Zap for such a long distance before. Finn forced a steady breath out his nose and pushed the thought from his mind. It wouldn't do to overthink it. Not right now, before the plunge. The ships were all very close now. The Jatan riders, men and women that he and Genevieve had trained together, drew their swords. Smoke rippled from the dragon's open maws as archers astride their backs raised bows. Swords and axes and shields were raised on the ships overhead, both friend and foe alike. Then, just as the Jatan ships were drawing astride the blockade, a tumultuous shout rose up from the Jatan armies. And Finn, holding tight to the saddle and the terrible terror clinging to his chest, took a deep breath as Zap dove beneath the surface. When Max took the plunge, Genevieve was briefly shocked by the cold of the ocean. Holding tight to her nose with her free hand so water wouldn't go up it, she squinted through the pain of the salty water in her eyes to see the darkness plummeting below. An entire sky beneath the sea. The thought caused her to yelp in fright and clamp her eyes tightly shut. She bore down against the pressure as Max dove, far enough beneath the ships that they prayed they wouldn't be seen. The terrible terror clutching at her chest growled in its throat, but it held still, as if bearing down on the instinct to survive. Finn had said that although terrors might not be water dragons, they held up surprisingly well. Perhaps she shouldn't have doubted him. Max's wings and legs cut through the water with powerful heaves. Never turning or wavering, always moving forward. Flashes of orange light cut through her vision. Cracking her eyes open again, she realized it was dragon fire from above. Dimly she could hear the cacophony of battle overhead, the shouts and screams of warriors fighting to break through the blockade. Or to keep it. A ghostly image formed in the corner of her eye and she almost gasped before realizing it was Finn and Zap. He met her eyes briefly before turning his gaze forward again. To her left she could see Pepper and Thunder keeping pace with their parents. Thuggery and Helga were holding on for dear life, their eyes and mouths clamped tightly shut. Genevieve's lungs began to burn, and looking up, she saw the ships were directly overhead. They were only halfway there. She patted Max on the shoulder twice and he instantly obeyed, surging forward even faster. Then something black plunged through the water near her elbow, close enough to make Genevieve jerk. She only just forced herself not to gasp. It had caught Finn's eye as well, and leaning down, they saw it was a sword, plummeting into the abyss. It had only just missed Max's wing. And then something large and heavy landed on top of her in a torrent of bubbles, cutting through Max's swim pattern. Genevieve couldn't help the gasp this time as she and Max were yanked downward, the thing kicking and thrashing. No, a person. The man who'd clearly fallen off his dragon into the water below seemed petrified that he'd fallen onto some sea creature. Genevieve fought to shove him off as they sank deeper and deeper, Max trying to stop the downward momentum. Pressure began to build in Genevieve's chest. A pair of light blue legs wrapped around the man and spun, tossing him toward the surface. The man kicked away as if petrified and eager to be free, though he was returning to a battle zone. Zap, and Finn spun back around, the terrible terror around Finn's neck clinging on for dear life. Spots began to dance in Genevieve's vision. No, they hadn't made it yet. She couldn't surface for air yet. She could make it, she would not be the reason they got caught. Zap grabbed onto Max's saddle and hauled him forward, helping to get him back on track. The pain in Genevieve's chest built and built. She would not. A ghostly hand grabbed her chin, but suddenly everything went dark. A moment or an eternity later, a watery voice was calling her name from somewhere far, far away. Breathe, Jenny, breathe. A choking sensation stole over her bones. All she could do was cough and hack up the salty water that had apparently flooded her lungs. It burned like knives and brought painful tears to her eyes, but soon she was heaving in grateful breaths. A pair of arms then circled her and she was clutched to a broad chest. Thank gods. Just breathe, I've got you. It was a long minute before her brain caught up, before she realized where they were, what had happened. Finn was holding her tightly and Max crooned worriedly at her hip. Apparently as soon as they'd surfaced he'd yanked her out of her saddle. Blinking the salt out of her eyes and raising her face, she saw the distant blockade. Far over Finn's shoulder the Jatan ships were battling Brandine's army. The sounds easily reached her ears over the water. The four shockjaws were all coasting on the surface, their wings spread out to keep them afloat. Thuggery and Helga were both stark white in their soaked clothes. Sorry, Genevieve said, pulling back. Finn also looked pale. Gods, when that guy fell on you, I thought he broke your neck. Do you feel okay? Yes. I might feel it later, but I'm all right. Genevieve said, honestly. She squeezed Thuggery's hand when he reached out. Truly. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Let's just hope that guy was one of ours, or else he might tell his cronies he saw us. Helga said. Thuggery nodded. Just in case, we'd better go. Finn nodded. Thug's right. Max doesn't have any injuries either, so we should go. Anyone could still see us from here. Genevieve nodded. How are the terrors? She clambered back onto Max's saddle and gave him a swift kiss between the horns. They're good. While we fly to Berk, I'll check the letters. What are the letters for? Thuggery asked as the dragons began an eastward tilt. Genevieve glanced at Finn and found he was making eye contact with any of them. The less you know the better, Thug. Now let's go. We've wasted enough time. After hours of scouring the ocean for any sign of approaching figures, whether it was Finn and the Jatan forces or enemy, Eric's eyes had begun to burn. The morning light reflecting off the ocean waves combined with the clear blue sky, dotted only by the occasional cloud, was enough to make the job of keeping a lookout a tedious affair. Even though he'd been disappointed when he was relieved of his shift, he didn't argue as Evan took his place. No sign of Finn and Jen or the Jatan army. Not so much as a speck on the horizon, which was both encouraging and disappointing. They had to be on their way by now. Ivan wouldn't wait around. And Finn, well, Eric could only pray now they had confirmation that Genevieve was safe, he was back in the saddle and heading home with his head on straight. It was understandable, Finn's reaction to Genevieve's hair in the box. And yet it was nothing to Eric except a calculated move by Brandine to force Finn out into the open. Eric had barely slept last night, knowing full well that if Finn and Helga were captured or lost at sea, they might not know for hours or days. Therefore it was no small relief when Ivan's letter arrived in the middle of the night informing them that they'd made it safely. Still, he didn't want to consider what would happen if Hiccup lost Finn, too. Or Adriana. The thoughts and risks were too much to allow him much rest, but he did his best, wrapped up in Adriana's arms, and she in his. Darin nestled between them in blankets. Adriana had put him to bed in his own room at first, and then 2 steps down the hall, she'd paused. Moments later she and Darin had barged into the master bedroom with his blankets and toys, ready for a sleepover. Darin was beyond excited, but Eric knew better. He didn't blame her, for many reasons, not least of which was the fact that she herself had once been snatched from her bed at Darin's age. There was too much at stake to take risks. They knew, despite Brandine signing his rights away as Darin's father on that fateful night, that he'd come for Darin eventually. Not when he had so much to gain from his biological child. Only a fool would suspect otherwise. Shaking his head to clear it, Eric climbed the stairs to the great hall. Though he didn't feel as tired as he probably looked, he could feel the stress weighing on his bones. He'd keep his cool though. While they waited for Finn to get back, they needed to prepare and keep their heads. Burke and the archipelago couldn't wait for action, lest the action be brought to them. And this was the last thing they needed. So his pep talk with Hiccup had been a calculated risk. Equal parts empathetic and firm, he hoped that it would snap Hiccup out of his funk. Thank the gods, it seemed to. There was no sign of the grieving Hiccup now. Now his green eyes were clear, his expression firm as he made orders and delegated various jobs. Any whispered doubts that had been made by the Burkians before his return had vanished. It was understandable for people to have doubts and concerns, but it was largely unhelpful. Chief he might be, Hiccup was still human. Nobody could expect him to not have some sort of emotional response with the very real fact that his wife had been captured. And this the final straw after finding out multiple friends had either disappeared or died. It was like watching someone cup water in their hands and expecting them to not spill. It was impossible, unrealistic, and utterly ridiculous to expect something different. At least, that's how Eric saw it. Snagging a small bag of nuts and dried berries from the full banquet table, Eric made for the head table. It was crowded with council members, all poring over maps and battle plans. Hiccup himself was staring down at a rather large map of the archipelago. A metal piece in the shape of a skrill was set over Berserker, which at this point they could only now assume was fully under Brandine's command. The problem lay in information, or rather the serious lack thereof. They didn't know how many ships Brandine had. How large his army was. Where he was heading next. Eric tossed a handful of nuts into his mouth as he approached, catching on to Fishleg's words as he spoke to Hiccup. It seemed he wasn't the only one thinking this as he heard, "Send scouts out for more information. It's simply not enough to make calculated guesses." Hiccup was nodding slowly, his fingers threaded as he surveyed the map. Eric knew he didn't want to send anyone out, but how were they to make the most of this situation if they didn't know, well, anything? "Send us out," Snotlout said, gesturing at himself and the twins, who both nodded. "We're old hands at this sort of thing. We can get a close-up view and—" "No." Snotlout rolled his eyes. "Hiccup, we can't sit around and wait. I know, but no offense, we need to be stealthy. I don't want to lose anyone else." Hiccup said firmly, eyes not leaving the map. "Fishlegs, how many riders do we have with Changewings?" Fishlegs checked his notes. "On the island. Almost 60. Snotlout, help him pick out the best dozen. Bring them here when you're done." Without another word, they stood and withdrew to another table to survey Fishleg's notes. Eric stepped closer, drawing a few eyes. "Will that be enough?" "It's the best we can do at the moment," Hiccup said. "Changeowings are stealthy, fast and efficient. And it's hard to fight once you're sprayed with their acid. They'll be all right." He was still playing it safe. And yet Eric could hardly blame him. Gods, he hoped nothing bad happened to Hiccup or Finn or Adriana. For a great number of reasons, but he didn't want to be the one making all these decisions. Not now, not ever. Hiccup at long last looked up from the map. How are the borders? Fine, as far as I can tell. Nothing at all, friend or foe. The chief pursed his lips. Clearly he'd been wondering about Jut's arrival, if it was coming or not. It was nearing 10 in the morning. Surely they were on their way by now. Ivan's letter wouldn't have suggested otherwise. Unless. Do you think they got held up? Eric asked. I hope not. Hiccup said. Sighing, he glanced at the gold coin resting over Jut on the map. They're a mighty force to be reckoned with. Brandine would be stupid to forget that. Eric felt an uncomfortable twisting in his stomach. Well, how long do you want to wait to hear from them? Hiccup was silent for a long moment while Eric and the remaining council members waited. Noon. If we don't see ships by noon, I'll send someone out. 2 hours. Anything could happen in 2 hours. Hey, how's it going? Eric and Hiccup looked up to see Adriana approach, her hand firmly wrapped around Darren's. She was dressed in her purple and black flight suit, which suited her frame. Her blonde hair was braided back, and for a painful moment, she reminded him of Astrid. He suspected Hiccup thought the same thing as he blinked in surprise and quickly looked at Darren. Hey buddy, come here. Darren eagerly scrambled into Hiccup's lap. His hands, still adorable with dimples of baby fat, slapped the tabletop eagerly. What doing, Poppy? Poppy is playing a game. Hiccup said. Adriana blinked. Dad, should we call it that? Hiccup gave her a small smile before adding, see, there was a time years and years ago that Poppy used to play a game with someone. He called it Maces and Talons. What we'd do is move our pieces around the board to try to outwit the other. He pushed a small figurine of Toothless across the map to Berserker. Should Poppy send his men here? He slid the figurine to Brawn, a likely place for Brandine to strike next due to its proximity. Or here. And whatever Poppy would do, his friend would do. To try to be smarter than each other. Eric briefly wondered who this individual had been and why Hiccup spoke of him in such a respectful tone. He had many enemies from the time before the Haddock twins' birth, but Eric had never heard of this strange person. A quick glance at Adriana showed the same bewilderment on her face. Did Poppy win? Darren asked. Hiccup smiled and gave him a squeeze. Yes. Poppy won. His smile slowly fell, as if he was lost in sudden memories. Darren nodded, as if satisfied in this response. Poppy always win. Poppy has biggest brain. A laugh rippled around the table at that. Hiccup grinned and tousled Darren's hair, smiling knowingly up at Adriana and Eric, who shared amused grins. Snotlout and Fishlegs returned, drawing Hiccup's attention. He allowed Darren to play with a few unused figurines for the moment and gave them his full attention, nodding at the names they provided. An arm snaked its way around Eric's waist and he turned, pressing a kiss to Adriana's temple. How are you doing? Good. I just hope Finn gets back soon. Adriana's lips bunched together as she thought. There's just too much going on. It'll be handled. Don't worry about it. Adriana gave him a searching look. Don't you worry about it, either. It's not your job to carry all this, you know. I know. Just trying to keep things in perspective, that's all. She saw right through him, of course. She knew his greatest fear lay in losing everyone and having to lead Burke himself. A fact that he'd thoroughly wished he'd never found out about and yet now seemed like a very real prospect. Babe, that's not going to happen. We don't know. Stop. Adriana said firmly, drawing the attention of a few so that she took his arm and pulled him away. She softened her tone. Stop. Mom might be captured but Brandine won't kill her. Annie, we don't know that. Eric said in a quiet whisper so it wouldn't carry. I don't want to think about it, but we have to consider it as a very real possibility. And the longer Finn takes to get back, the more I worry. I understand. Trust me, I do. But I honest to gods don't think Brandine will kill her. Adriana said. The more I thought about it last night, he couldn't have planned on her being there. You know, Mom. She probably saw the smoke and went to investigate and somehow got captured. It's a point in Brandine's favor, but what does he have to gain by killing her? No, something tells me he'll save her for later. Eric searched her face. And when did you get so interested in strategies of war and critical thinking? I've read a few books, you know. Adriana said, planting her hands on her hips. And I've always had critical thinking. Pulling her closer by a leather strap on her suit, Eric gave her a roguish smile. I know. I just wanted to see your reaction. As if I'd ever assume you weren't one of the smartest here. Ha, right. Adriana set her hands on his chest and then looked down at his outfit. Also, I've never seen you in so much get-up. To be honest, it's really hot. Too right, it is. Eric rolled his eyes but couldn't fight the amused grin. Roguish woman. Sexy husband. Hey, if you two are done over there. They glanced over to see Snotlout crossing his arms with raised brows. We've got more important things going on here than foreplay. Hiccup's eyes widened and he set his hands on Darren's ears, though he was happily uninterested in their conversation as the toothless figurine roared at the skrill. Adriana seemed nonplussed. Sorry, Snotlout. We'll be sure to take it in the cupboards next time. No, that's where the food is stored. Hiccup, control your icky children. Eric tried his hardest to not blush amongst all the men and women who were now grinning and elbowing each other, but instead found himself saying, Your prudence is a balm, as always, Snotlout. Don't you get cheeky with me, Larson. Despite the fear of the unknown, the laughter in the great hall was appreciated. It changed the atmosphere and released some of the tension, especially in Hiccup as he also laughed and gave his kids a knowing look. It wasn't hard to imagine Astrid's spirit being right here with them, quick with her own quips and teasing insults. They would be alright, Eric thought. He couldn't plan for every variable, but he knew that it would take a lot to destroy the Burkean spirit, even now. They would be alright. The doors opened and they all turned to see a group of men and women decked out in red riding gear. Covered in the oily secretions of their chain-chewing scales, they were easily able to blend into the camouflage backdrops that their dragons could manipulate, turning them nearly invisible. It wasn't foolproof, but it was enough for reconnaissance missions. Among them strode his estranged brother, Nicholas. Their eyes met for a moment before Nicholas stuck his nose in the air and pretended as if he and Adriana didn't exist. Things never had mended between them in the years since Eric found out his older brother was the one who spread the rumor about him and Adriana. That she'd run away because he had gotten her pregnant, not Brandine. The thought still made Eric's blood boil, though he tried to ignore it whenever they bumped shoulders. Darren, Adriana said, reaching out a hand to their son. Why don't we go find some lunch and leave Poppy to his game, huh? Despite pretending they didn't exist, Nicholas scoffed. War is a game to you. That's what you're teaching your son. Darren looked up at him with wide eyes. A surge of anger rose up in Eric's chest unbidden. But before he could speak, Adriana beat him to it in a calm voice. Be safe on your mission, Nicholas. Come on, Darren. Say bye-bye to Poppy. Hiccup gave him a squeeze and set him down. I'll see you later, okay buddy? Give Poppy back his figurines. Adriana said. Darren looked down at the small dragons in his hands before holding them up to Hiccup, who took them. Thanks, buddy. Looking up at Nicholas with a nervous look that set Eric's teeth on edge, Darren took Adriana's hand and followed her to the doors. For free, he was very in tune to people's emotions. Much like Adriana had always been. The fact that he could sense Nicholas's distaste was almost enough to unscrew Eric's jaw. And yet a slight warning look from Hiccup was enough to make him follow his wife and son out the door. It would do nothing to bicker, and Nicholas was about to join a reconnaissance mission. They needed to set aside petty disputes, though the word petty rattled through his skull like rice in a toy rattle. Years. It had been years and still they hadn't come to terms with their differences. Well, that was fine with him. Until Nicholas could get a grip and stop being a self-serving, arrogant ass. Once outside, Adriana released Darren's hand and gave him an encouraging smile to walk on ahead. He obeyed, and before he was gone 2 steps, she turned a look on him. What? Eric demanded. She raised a brow. You're fuming. Eric grit his teeth. So? That's all you've got to say is so? How can you be okay with the way he treats you? Eric demanded, unable to stop himself. And the way Darren looked at him like he was afraid. Because kindness is often a balm to a bitter heart. Adriana said. He doesn't deserve anything from you, Annie. No. But what does it do to be nasty back? It only gives him satisfaction. Eric shook his head, frustrated in a way he couldn't describe. Maybe it was due to everything else setting his teeth on edge already and this was a mere outlet. But no, even with all the stress of the villages and Astrid's disappearance and Finn's long-awaited return, none of those had cracked through his mask like Nicola's had. Adriana's expression gentled. I know it upsets you because you want to protect us. But Darren and I are fine, regardless of what Nicholas thinks. She was right. In his heart, he knew she was right. And yet he still felt anger coursing through his veins. Nothing would ever change Nicholas, and to even consider it was a waste of time. He'd chosen to not waste his time on people who disrespected Adriana, and if that included a member of his own family, so be it. Adriana pursed her lips but, seeing that he wasn't going to be swayed, let the subject drop. Come on. There were some vendors open in the market. Let's get something to eat before the lines get too long. Nodding distantly, Eric followed her down the stairs. He glanced out at the ocean, which still glittered in the late morning sunlight. Still no sign of dragons or ships from the west. Sighing, he dropped his gaze and picked up his pace, his mismatched steps clapping against old worn stone. Inga slipped between the rows of soldiers, not bothering to apologize or make eye contact. Inside the satchel slung around her waist she had an assortment of healer's items, but buried at the bottom was a dagger, a jar of changeling poison and its antidote, and other necessities. It was difficult to know what she'd need for her mission, but, well, the more she carried with her without raising too much suspicion, the better. She'd had enough. Chieftains, dead. Berserker Island, destroyed. Astrid Haddock, missing. As she'd suspected all along and refused to admit, Alton and Johann's disappearance had been the first stroke to a poem of death and destruction. And she was done sitting by, watching it be written. Only this time, she wasn't going to lose control. Being angry would only draw attention, like it had drawn Finn's yesterday. Was it only yesterday that she'd tried to leave and he'd convinced her to stay? It felt like years ago. And just as she'd said, if something happened to Genevieve, he'd be the first to split. The first to throw caution to the wind, say screw the rules and regulations and safety protocols, and take off to Jut to make sure his beloved was safe. Though she hated the hypocrisy of it, she didn't blame him. At the end of the day, now he understood what that fear felt like. Then again, maybe that wasn't a fair assessment, given his history. Maybe he threw such caution to the wind because of his past, because the thought of losing the one he loved most was abhorrent. It wasn't about heroism or making a statement. Maybe it was still unwise and hypocritical, but why should he care about that when Genevieve was more important? And by all accounts, so was Alton. So, straightening her flight suit and checking to make sure everything was buckled as it should be, Inga raised her chin and strode into the hatchery like a woman on a mission. A completely legal mission. She only prayed her parents and brothers were all elsewhere and wouldn't find out for some time what she'd done. Inga took the stairs with measured steps, a far cry from the fury she'd let loose yesterday. She could still feel that fury in her veins, pulsing in a quiet corner of her heart. She'd let it loose one day, but not yet. Not until she found Alton. Not until he was safe. And until then, she'd keep her cool. Besides, for her own health and safety, she had to keep a tight leash on herself. Lest she find herself worse off than she intended. Which, had been another of Finn's points, now she thought of it. Pushing that thought aside, Inga strode into Misty's pen. With her Changewing already saddled and ready for their trip, Inga led her from the pen out onto the landing platform where the group of men and women were gathered for their reconnaissance mission. Changewings raised their heads and sniffed at Misty, who raised her nose in a dignified manner. The leader of the group, a man named Harold, turned in surprise. "Hello there, Missy. What can I do for ya?" Better be quick now, we're about to leave. Inga met his eyes dead on. I'm coming with you. The gathered riders blinked in shock, taking in her measure from her gear to Misty's saddle and weapons. Harold blinked in surprise. The council chose the 12 to leave. They didn't mention change of plan, but Inga said, crossing her arms. Chief's orders. He wants a healer to go with you all in case something happens. Gods forbid someone is stupid enough to be seen, but anything can happen on this mission, right? I'd hate to be the man or woman who dies out there because you ignored the chief's order. A rustle between the riders over Harold's shoulders. Nicholas Larsen's eyes narrowed in suspicion. Fine. Inga said, throwing up her hands when Harold said nothing after a long pause. I'll just go tell the chief that you refused his wishes and further wasted precious time. All right, lass. Harold said in a tight voice over her shoulder. She smirked broadly but quickly wiped it away before turning back. You sure about this, then? It will be dangerous. Inga barked a laugh and pulled herself into the saddle. Danger? I'm a Jorgensen. The only ones who should be worried are the enemy. Just stay close to me. Harold said. The last thing I need is to tell Snotlout his daughter got shot down in enemy territory. Gods know why he even approved this mission. As the other riders pulled themselves into their own saddles, Inga gave as nonchalant a shrug as she could. Alas, Daddy has to learn to trust me sometime. She couldn't quite ignore the twinge of guilt in her chest. Her parents would be furious and extremely worried. They'd perhaps never trust her again. But she was doing this for Alton. She would find him and bring him home. Hell, she'd do it before Tarin gave birth and she'd be the healer to help her with that, too. Leave it to a Jorgensen to do everything. As she pulled her helmet over her face to shield it from the wind and the ocean spray, Inga glanced over her shoulder at the bustling village one last time and smirked. If you won't come to me, Alton Brand, then I'll come to you. Hang on, I'm coming. Finally forcing himself to take a break of sorts, Hiccup found himself standing at the cliff's edge, protected only by the wooden fence around the perimeter of the village. He'd been the one to insist all those years ago that a fence was needed, after Finn fell and nearly broke his neck. It was the first time he'd ever been knocked unconscious, falling onto a crumbling piece of rock that only just held together long enough for Hiccup and a few others to rescue him. Before he plummeted to his death. Now Hiccup stared across the sea toward the west. They hadn't heard any news from Finn or Ivan since last night's letter. Now it was nearing dinner time and the worry was starting to set in again. Eric's pep talk that morning had helped clear his head. Astrid wouldn't want him to fall to pieces. Wherever she was, she would stay strong. It wasn't the first time she'd been taken and it wasn't the first time she'd been forced to do so. She'd be alright. But Finn. Without Finn here, should something happen to himself, Hiccup would be forced to put the responsibility of Burke's safety in Adriana's hands. And by extension, Eric's. It wasn't a thought he wanted to endure, and yet endure it he must. It had rattled around in his brain with each passing hour. Perspective. Realistic perspective. That's all it was, and yet it was frightening. He had to keep these things in mind or else find themselves in a worse-off predicament. Well, if something bad happened to him, he supposed he wouldn't be aware of it. It was morbid, but it was true. And he wasn't doing them any favors by tiptoeing around it. Which is why he pushed down the fear as he heard them approach. Darin was nowhere to be seen, which likely meant he was with one of his grandmothers. At his questioning look, Adriana confirmed that he was with Lara. Lara and Lofn are taking turns. Eric added, glancing at Adriana. Indeed she didn't look happy about it but, well, Adriana had to trust that someone besides herself could watch their son for a few minutes. Adriana sighed, as if pushing that very thought from her mind. You wanted to talk to us. Hiccup looked them over. Eric was still dressed in his armor and weapons, Adriana in her flight suit. They both had wary and yet firm expressions. Readying themselves for what he would say next. You know I can't protect you both from everything that could happen. Hiccup said at last. As much as I might want to, you know I can't. Adriana blinked, her green eyes filling with worry. Did something happen? If it did. No. At least, not that I'm aware of. Hiccup ran a hand through his hair. Only. Finn's not back yet. Jet is nowhere to be seen and the scouts I sent after lunch haven't come back. They didn't send a terror back like they were supposed to. Eric looked grim. So something is happening out there. And the more men you send out there to find out what that is, the less men we have here. Adriana finished. But Finn, he has to be okay. Ivan said he was okay. Maybe he's stuck on Jet for some reason. That's the best we can hope for. Hiccup gazed down the docks far below, watching as men and women continued to fill and fix the ships in the harbor, preparing them for battle. The Burkean spirit was strong, even now, but Hiccup couldn't tell them everything. He hated keeping secrets from anyone, but unfortunately that was a part of leading. People wanted the truth, wanted every bit of knowledge so they could say they knew every bit of what was happening. But if that was the case, there would be riots in the streets. Fear would take hold and those in charge wouldn't be able to keep a handle on their own people, let alone make decisions outside the borders. Secrets were necessary to leadership. And that was perhaps the thing he hated most about it, short of sending people out to do the dirty work. To risk their lives for him. All because he told them to. Dad. Hiccup blinked, forcing his thoughts back to the present. If Finn doesn't come back and something happens to me, I hope you both understand what that means. He didn't mean it to come out so blunt, and yet maybe it was better that way. Maybe they'd had enough of that. Indeed, both their faces tightened, as if they'd expected this. We know. Eric said quietly. We've already talked about it. Hiccup stepped closer and set a hand on both of their shoulders, giving them each a firm squeeze and a firm look. These people will follow you. They're loyal to our family, to what it represents. If something happens to me. Daddy, stop. Adriana said. Addie, if something happens to me, these people will be furious. She blinked, as if she hadn't expected that. Yes. Hiccup said, turning to Eric. That will make them stronger. And Finn. He's their future. Take that away. The hooligan tribe will be a force to be reckoned with. Don't underestimate that. Adriana was trembling slightly under his hand. But a steely look had entered Eric's eyes, a look he probably didn't understand. Should the worst happen, Hiccup said, burning with pride. You both are going to do just fine. Don't you doubt yourselves for a second. Finn might be the heir, but you two know just as much about leading this island as he does. Don't ever forget that. Adriana grabbed him in a tight hug, catching him by surprise. Smiling, he hugged her back. I know you don't want to hear it, but it's true. Just in case. Instead of arguing or dissuading these thoughts, Adriana merely nodded. As if she'd known all along that this conversation would happen. Eric opened his mouth to speak and then froze, his eyes glued to something on the horizon. Turning, Hiccup looked around and spied a series of dots on the horizon. Adriana, seeing them as well, gasped. Riders. Hiccup whipped out his spyglass. The riders were still very far away so he could only just make out who they were. 4 shock jaws. Is it them? Eric asked. Hiccup sucked in a breath. Half a dozen other riders were on their tails and judging by their raised weapons, they weren't fellow Jetans. To the west. Hiccup shouted down the cliff. All the men and women below and on the nearby embattlements froze, then scurried into a frenzy. Friendlies under attack, get to them now. Without another word to Eric and Adriana, Hiccup sprinted into the village where he'd last seen Toothless. He'd been gathered among dozens of dragons, all gazing around as if waiting for orders. His son was in trouble and there wasn't a second to lose. Finn hissed through his teeth as Zap twisted in midair and swiped her tail in a backwards arc, flinging a bolt of lightning toward the riders on their tails. They quickly dove and rebounded, blasts of fire and arrows whooshing through the air. Zap dodged and tucked in her wings, trying to regain speed. Burke loomed in the distance. So close. The enemy riders seemed to know it, too. Even though they were risking their own capture, their own lives to be attacking so close to Burke, they didn't seem to care. They were willing to do whatever it took to kill him, even if it was suicide for them. An arrow whooshed by, close enough to nick his leg. Through the flash of pain, Finn glanced down and was momentarily grateful to see it had only cut through the thick material of his boot. The worst he'd have was a bruise. But he was dead if he got an arrow in his back. Thuggery drew astride him on Thunder, both of them snarling. His sword flashed and knocked another arrow out of the air, clearly aimed for Finn. Thunder and Pepper rebounded with another volley of shock waves. Genevieve, Helga and Thuggery had barely been attacked, confirming their suspicions upon being sighted halfway to Burke that they had a single target in mind. Brandine wanted Finn dead. Though the others had sported minor injuries and been attacked out of necessity, they'd spent the majority of the rushed flight keeping Finn alive and fighting back. Exhaustion weighed on each of them, and the various small injuries on all 4 dragons weighed on Finn's soul more than anything. These dragons were his family, his babies. He'd raised them himself, aside from Maximum. If he wasn't so vastly outnumbered and exhausted to boot, he'd throttle them all. Finn heard the frustrated grunt of an enemy soldier and near instantly felt the crash of another arrow clanging off the shield on his back. They were so close to the braziers now, and he could hear the warning bells on the island, could see his people fighting to get into the air to help them. But there wasn't enough time. He'd be shot and killed before they got here. Then from somewhere far overhead, a shrill whistle filled the air. Genevieve's eyes went wide and she snatched at Max's reins. "Steady!" Finn shouted. "Stay put!" Another arrow clanged on his shield, sending a shooting pain through his limbs. If they caught him in the neck. Toothless' sonic whistle filled the air, and seconds later, a blast of purple fire hit the nearest enemy and exploded. The scream of the rider and the dragon were instantaneous, and the smell of burnt hair and leather filled the air. The other enemy riders floundered but kept to their target. More Burkian riders were flapping upward now, getting closer, so close. Toothless and his dad shot between them and the enemy, scattering them further. But it wasn't enough to stop the final arrow that finally caught Finn in the armor beneath his arm, nearly throwing him out of the saddle with a cry. Genevieve screamed. The pain was a distant thing. Not nearly as painful as he'd expected, but Finn growled. "Enough. If they wanted him so badly, then so be it." Zap. Finn groaned. Her mouth frothed with exhaustion and eyes filled with fury. Zap met his expression with a growl of her own. Then tucked in her wings. They fell like a pair of stones, head first. Genevieve and the others faded away into the distance, her blood-curdling screams lost to the wind. Then Toothless and his dad whistled by, their matching green eyes wide with fury and terror. Then there was nothing but the air. Shouts of fury echoed in his ears behind him. The enemies had followed them into the nosedive. Good. Gritting his teeth past the pain and the pull of gravity, Finn pulled himself lower into the saddle, closer to Zap's back as she dove. His stomach swooped into this throat as they gathered speed. Too fast. Zap isn't strong enough to pull out of this. Too late now. Come on. Finn shouted, the ocean looming closer and closer. You got this, baby girl, come on. Roaring her fury for all the world to hear, unaware of the thousands of eyes on them, Zap dove. Finn barely registered the screams of the riders behind them as they tried to pull out of the dives but couldn't. The dive was too steep, the speed too much for their dragons to handle. But it was all lost as he slammed his forehead into the saddle and prayed to every god he knew that he wasn't about to break every bone in his body. They hit the water with a mighty crash, plummeting into the depths of the ocean with unmatched speed, momentum and ferocity. If he could have looked back, he'd have seen the tunnel of bubbles that he and Zap had just created, closely followed by the crashes of men, dragons, and weapons as they crashed into the sea with much less grace. But he couldn't. The impact of the water nearly knocked the wind out of him, and only instinct kept his mouth shut. He clung to Zap with everything he had, bearing down on the pull of the water as they descended deeper and deeper. He could feel Zap's muscles straining to fight the pull, to take them back to the surface, but her wing beats were struggling. She was already exhausted. And due to the exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through his own body, he was having a hard time holding his breath. The sea was a dark blanket, numbing his senses. The water was cold and unforgiving. And they were lost in the abyss. Zap finally slowed enough to turn them upward, but the sudden motion caused water to shoot up his nose. Instinct to breathe kicked in and a rush of panic filled him. Don't panic, don't panic. her growls rumbling in his ears and in his chest. Zap fought to reach the surface. The light shimmered on the surface far above. The enemies were struggling in the water somewhere in the distance, and already a few skiffs were heading toward them, likely teeming with Burkian soldiers. Suddenly he felt very tired. Struggling against the straps binding his legs to Zap's saddle, he was at her mercy. Unable to free himself, to do anything. Then something massive dove into the ocean behind them. He couldn't see it, but he could hear it, felt the rush of bubbles as a dragon dove nearby. Toothless suddenly appeared, shoving his body beneath Zap's and using his powerful wings and legs to raise them up higher, faster. A body collided with Finn's, and then his dad was there with a dagger, slicing through the bindings on his legs. He was yanked out of the saddle and pulled upward toward the surface. Finn felt like his chest was about to burst as an arm clamped around his middle, pulling him up, up, up. They broke the surface and he gasped, then hacked and coughed as the water went into his mouth. "I've got you. I've got you, don't panic." Confusion settled in. That wasn't his dad, that was Eric. Charger was in the water, holding still as best he could as Eric dragged him toward the saddle. "Can you pull yourself up?" He didn't have words from the exhaustion but reached up all the same. A searing pain echoed from his left side, but he ignored it, trying and failing to haul himself out of the water. Breathing hard, he dropped his forehead onto Charger's side and shook his head. "It's okay, just breathe," Eric said, squeezing his shoulder. Blonde hair curled in ringlets around his face, he instead pulled himself out of the water and instructed Charger to swim to the docks. "Wait," Finn croaked. "Zap. My dad." But he needn't have worried. A moment later a surge of water burst upward a few wing paces away. Zap shook her head and appeared to be breathing hard from exhaustion. Hiccup and Toothless were also panting, but their eyes were clear as they escorted Zap toward the docks. Gods, how the hell had they survived that? "Are you alright?" Hiccup asked. Finn merely shook his head. For once in his life, he didn't have words. He only had strength left to hold on to Charger's saddle as he swam for the docks. Cliff was sure his hair looked a mess from running his hands through it repeatedly. He'd been on a walk when Hiccup's shout rose and the village exploded into action. He'd watched as his friends approached on their dragons, fighting to stay alive. He'd watched helplessly as Finn and Zap suddenly dropped out of the sky, petrified, unsure if they were dead or if they'd done it on purpose. Watched their flawless dive and realized it had been on purpose, to bait the enemy into crashing below. Watched as Hiccup and Eric both dove in after them, Charger remaining on the surface to receive their wounded friend. Because one way or another, Cliff was quite sure Finn was wounded. Now he was consoling Genevieve, who'd landed at the top of the cliff with Thuggery and Helga. All of them and their dragons looked exhausted. Pepper and Thunder both panted so hard they were gagging, nearly ill, so they were quickly ushered away to the hatchery. Max looked only slightly better, though he was covered in a series of cuts. He growled lowly as multiple men tried to clean him up, but clearly he wasn't having it. Genevieve was staring down into the harbor with terror, wringing her hands so hard they'd gone red. Finn had just been pulled out of the water and was waiting for Zap, who looked to be struggling. "He looks okay," Cliff said in a firm voice. He got shot before they dove," Genevieve said in a quivering voice. "He could be bleeding to death under all that armor, and if they don't get him to Mars now." It seemed to take a great effort, but Zap finally heaved herself onto the docks and promptly collapsed. Growling stubbornly, Max dove off the cliff and glided to the water below, where he could be by her side. A crowd of bodies gathered around her as they inspected her condition. Soon though, Hiccup and Finn stood, leaving her care to fish legs as Finn was ushered up the docks. Cliff kept a firm hand on Genevieve's shoulder as she shook in place, but she made no move to shake him off. He couldn't help with much, but he'd stand with her in solidarity. He wasn't sure how much that was worth, but it was something. He hoped. By the time they reached the top of the cliff, a crowd had already gathered. Hiccup firmly waved them aside, clearly wanting to get Finn to the healers as soon as possible. His face was white enough that his freckles stood out and he looked exhausted, but his blue eyes were clear as they searched the crowd. They landed on Genevieve right as she pulled out of Cliff's hold. She threw herself into his arms, gripping him tightly and bursting into tears. Finn held her to him tightly, looking up at Cliff through the curls obscuring his vision. "Thank you," he seemed to be saying. Nodding, Cliff gave him a small smile. Perhaps it had meant something then. Genevieve was babbling something about an arrow and Finn was hushing her gently. Hiccup ushered the few council members away as they began talking in his ear about the captured riders who'd tried to kill them. Cliff stood there, feeling slightly awkward. Perhaps his role was finished, now that everyone was back. He wondered if he should head back to the shop where there was more work to be done. Slowly turning on his heel, Cliff shoved his hands into his pockets, but a voice called him back. "Where are you going, Cliffy?" It was Finn. "Ah." Cliff paused. "Back to the shop, I guess." "Why?" "I need you to do something for me." Finn turned his back to his dad and the council. He pulled a sopping wet, thickly wrapped clump of plastic from his breast pocket inside which appeared to be paper. "I need you to unwrap these and make sure they are still readable. If all of them are ruined, let me know, but if some of them are good then just make a clean copy for the bad ones. Once you're done, mail them using the 3 terrors I brought from Jut. They already know where to go. I need it done as soon as possible." Noting the way he seemed to be hiding them from the chief, Cliff quickly took them and shoved them into his own breast pocket, right as Hiccup turned. "Who are they for?" "Never mind that," Finn said in a low voice, sensing his father's approach. "But don't tell anyone about them." The seriousness on his friend's face made him all the more curious, and yet he knew it was no small thing. The fact that Finn apparently had secrets and was choosing him to carry them on. "Why me?" "Because I need this done and I don't have time." And Finn added, "I know I can trust you when it counts." Something unidentifiable warmed in his chest. "Thanks, Finn. That means more than you know." Genevieve gave him a warm smile but it quickly vanished as Hiccup set a hand on Finn's shoulder, drawing his attention as well. "Okay, let's get to Morris." "We don't have time for that," Finn said, meeting his dad's tense expression. "We have a problem." "Finn, you could be bleeding," Genevieve said, her dark eyes catching on the damaged armor under his arm. "We're going to Morris whether you like it or not." "Fine. But you'd better bring the council," Finn said to his dad. "We're going to need every clear head we can get." Cliff caught sight of Helga and Thuggery slumped against the fence nearby, catching their breath. They weren't talking, which he hoped was only due to exhaustion. Hopefully one good thing could come of all this. As Genevieve steered Finn toward the village square, Hiccup on their heels, Cliff turned the opposite direction. He passed Eric and Adriana, both of whom were deep in conversation. If the package in his pocket wasn't burning a hole through his clothes, he might have stopped to talk. Except Finn wanted it taken care of right away, so he quickened his pace instead. He found himself walking to his house. It was likely the best place to read Finn's letters without someone barging in on him. And luckily Taryn wasn't home as she'd decided to spend the day at her parents'. She'd taken to this a lot since finding out about Alton's disappearance. Some days he found the house too quiet or spending loads of time at his in-laws' house taxing after many days in a row, but now he was grateful for her absence. Something he thought he'd never think before. As he pushed his door open and locked it, he wondered how he was going to keep this secret, whatever it was, from Taryn. He'd never kept secrets from her before. But Finn was heir to the tribe. If he trusted Cliff to keep something quiet, then he'd have to find a way to do it. Wasn't he just thinking over the last few days that he wished he could do his part? Help in some way? Well, this was his chance. He wouldn't screw it up. And besides, it was just sending a few letters out. The terrors were waiting for him back at the cliffside near the docks. It wasn't uncommon for terrors to roost on the fence there, so nobody would question 3 terrors waiting for him. Why should anyone suspect him of keeping secrets? If he just acted like there was nothing on his mind, then he could handle this. Sitting at the table, he drew out the wet package from his pocket and quickly began to unwrap it. Though the plastic was wrapped in numerous layers and sealed with a sticky material not unlike what his aunt used for sealing minor wounds together, the papers nestled in the center were surprisingly dry. It seemed before they left Jut, they had thought to do their due diligence just in case Finn needed to go in the water. Regardless, the letters were dry. He supposed he didn't need to read them. If any had been, he would have had to rewrite them. Feeling like he'd wasted a trip, Cliff leaned back in his chair with a huff. He squinted at the 3 letters that lay there, mocking him in their perfection. Why couldn't at least one have been ruined? Now he was being petty. Pouting at a bunch of important letters that he now didn't get to read because they happened to be well protected and therefore, didn't need his expertise after all. Then again, Finn wouldn't care if he read them either way. Snatching the topmost letter, Cliff quickly opened it. He vaguely wondered why Finn hadn't used his seal ring to keep it closed, then thought better of it. Perhaps if the letters fell into the wrong hands on their way to their apparent secret destinations, he didn't want the enemy recognizing his seal. Frowning, he had a strong feeling that he wasn't far off. With a feeling of trepidation, he opened the letter, and realized that he was right. The paragraph of jumbled letters made absolutely no sense to him whatsoever. "It's a code," Cliff whispered. Shutting the letter and putting it back in its protective sleeve, he dropped it back onto the pile. So much for trust. Finn might trust him to do this little task for him because he didn't have time, but what did that matter if he knew that Cliff wouldn't know what he was reading? Not without the key anyway. A key that surely fearless Finn wouldn't just leave lying around. Not if he really wanted to keep the contents of these letters safe and secret. But who were his correspondents? Who would Finn be keeping tabs with that he didn't want his dad, the council, or the rest of his family to know about? Perhaps Genevieve knew, but he'd get nothing from her. Kind and bright as a patch of sunshine she might be, she wouldn't betray Finn's confidence. Not to satisfy Cliff's curiosity anyway. Sighing, Cliff stood and shoved the letters back into his breast pocket, careful not to tear or bend them. It was just another little task to do. A little thing delegated to someone else so Finn wouldn't have to do it. Cliff hated making it about himself or feeling like it had been pointless, but he just felt rather superfluous. And now everyone was meeting to find out what had taken them so long to get home. Now he was doing superfluous jobs and behind the times. Combine that with the fact that they'd kept Alton and Johann's disappearances a secret from him until he'd forced it out of them. Cliff suddenly felt a strong sense of resentment rise in his chest. Did Finn give him this job just to keep him out of the way? Cliff huffed and left the house. He didn't want to believe it. Surely his friends wanted him around, right? Or did his reputation of being a crazy nut finally grate on their nerves one too many times? Or were they all so stressed about everything going on that they didn't want to deal with his obnoxiousness? These and other thoughts swirled through his mind, weighing down every step as he stalked back to the cliffside. As expected, the terrors were still dutifully waiting. The area was rather deserted now that the excitement had died down. Still he glanced around to be sure nobody was watching. He saw no one and quickly tied each letter to the terror's legs before sending them off on their missions. He watched as 2 cut east and the other turned north. Many allies were north, that was common knowledge. There were many to the south, too. But east. Sighing, Cliff slumped against the fence. There were too many questions and emotions buzzing through his mind, most of them self-inflicted. Maybe he had good reason for feeling the way he did, or maybe he didn't. Maybe this was one reason his friends seemed to be pulling away. Because he was making it about him when in fact they had more important things to be dealing with. Finn could have died today, after all. That was more important than his petty attitude. Still, as the sun began its downward descent toward the sunrise, Cliff couldn't help but wonder if this is where adulthood really took hold of its denizens. When life grabbed each person by the throat and didn't let go, and the casualties were the friendships you made along the way. Hiccup paced the length of the healer's office as Finn talked, explaining the reasons for the delay. A blockade cutting jet off from the rest of the archipelago. Their friends Genevieve's family fighting, even now, to break it. Genevieve, Thuggery and Helga also chimed in, filling in details that Finn might have missed. All the while Mara, Heather and Roughnut patched their wounds. Each of them sported minor cuts and bruises, particularly Helga and Thuggery. Each of them had clearly fought tooth and nail to keep Finn alive on the flight back to Berk, and he would be forever grateful. For Genevieve's part, after explaining her near brush with death by going under the blockade, Mara had inspected her breath. After forcing her into a new change of clothes and sat her down with a strong cup of tea, Genevieve's color was quickly returning. Finn, though. He was still pale, though Hiccup suspected that was due to pain more than anything. He was doing his best to hide it, but as Mara peeled off layer after layer of flight gear, armor, and then finally his shirt, they all sucked in a breath. That bad, huh? Finn hissed, trying and failing to get a closer look at the massive bruise forming on his ribs. Lie back. Mara instructed. Inga, get some, she broke off with an irritated huff. Heather, ice please. Heather obeyed without question, but she too looked annoyed. Now that Hiccup glanced around, he realized the young Jorgensen girl was nowhere to be seen. Where is Inga? Finn asked, noticing as well. Not a clue. Mara said stiffly, rummaging through a basket of clinking jars until she withdrew one with a dark paste. She said she had an errand to run this morning and said she'd be back, but didn't specify when or where she was going. She might have picked a better day to disappear, or she could have just asked for the day off. Finn frowned in concern but said nothing. Do you want someone to go look for her? Hiccup asked. Heather reappeared with a large bag of ice in her hands. Wrapping it in a towel, she set it carefully onto Finn's ribs and he hissed through his teeth. No, you've got enough to deal with, Hiccup. I'll talk to her later. They were interrupted by the door opening and in swept Eric, Adriana and Cliff. Adriana rushed to her brother's side to check on his condition while Eric checked on Genevieve, who gave him a tired smile. Her forearm wrapped heavily in gauze, Helga at last waved her mother off with as lazy of a wave as she could muster. What happened to the guys attacking us? They're each in a cell. Hiccup said. As soon as I'm content none of you are going to keel over, I'm going to question them. Good luck. Thuggery said from his own cot. He looked exhausted from the rough flight, but his eyes were clear. What will you do about Jut? Hiccup crossed his arms. I'm not sure yet. Do you think Ivan can break through? Hard to say. Finn said slowly. I couldn't get a clear number of men on the blockade, but ships to riders seemed to be about equal. At least from what I could see. This explains why your scouts never came back or sent a letter back. Eric said. They must have gotten caught in the crossfire or captured. Hiccup felt a pang for the men he'd sent. All he could hope was they were fighting on Jut's side and would make it there safely. Well, we can't leave Jut to fight alone. Adriana said. We could send out some riders to help. We could, Eric said. But that would leave us with less fighters here. What's Brandine's plan overall? Get us to split up our army and make us weaker? Or was his goal just to keep Jut occupied for as long as possible, knowing full well that, combined with Burke's forces, we'd actually have a fighting chance? I hate to say it, Finn sighed. But Eric's right. Thanks for that. No, I mean, if we split up our forces and send part of our army to Jut, we'll have less men to fight with here. What if Brandine's expecting that? We'd be playing right into his hands, and it's no small amount of time to change course after that. No, I think Jut is a diversion. Genevieve set down her empty cup. I agree. Ivan will be alright. They won't give up without a strong fight. They'll break through the blockade and they'll come to our aid, just as he promised. Hiccup had to admire her faith. Anyone else with far less to lose, with far less loved ones on the line, would be falling to pieces with the possibilities. And yet she was as strong-willed and stubborn as her fiancé. He had to believe that Ivan would pull through. I agree. Hiccup said at last. If we get a message from Ivan calling for aid, then we'll send riders out. We won't ignore them if we hear anything. But in the meantime we need to focus on our own borders. Everything that's happened so far is a bunch of plays on a chessboard. He's striking at our pawns and our strongest fighters. We need to be ready to retaliate and keep Burke safe. We could make a run for it. Cliff said suddenly, drawing everyone's attention. He blinked in surprise at himself. Not like, run away. I mean, make it look like we're running but make them chase us into a trap we've set. I don't know. Eric said, his brow pinched in thought. The only thing that would bait him enough to draw him into the open is Hiccup himself, but I don't think he'd take it. He wouldn't abandon whatever plan he's concocted for such a random move. Finn shrugged. I don't know, he might take the bait. He hates my dad enough. If his bloodlust is strong enough and my dad was alone. I'm not going anywhere. Hiccup said firmly. I appreciate the idea though, kiddo. Cliff gave a small lopsided smile. Honestly, Chief, the thought of you turning tail and running in the face of danger is absurd. Like if you were to suddenly get a crazy idea to leave the only home you've ever known and by extension, abandon the best stronghold in your arsenal. I mean, it wouldn't take a calculating brain to see the stupidity of it, you know. Not when you have a dragon-riding army at your disposal. This is true. Hiccup said, fighting a smile as everyone chuckled. Berk does have many advantages. Besides, where would we go? Probably hours and hours to the west. Why west? Finn asked. I dunno, too many enemies to the north and it's too cold for night furies to boot. Too many enemies clustered in the east and you can only go so far south before you run into a barbarian or two. Cliff said, ignoring the snorts that echoed around the room. So that leaves the west. We'd be neighbors with Jut. Genevieve said. Except we'd have to make a new stronghold out of an island ill-prepared for new habitation, so, there wouldn't be much preparation for a battle. Yeah, but who needs an army when you could just send the original gang into battle? Cliff said, raising his voice over the ensuing scoffs and hilarity. Hiccup, find Mama Astrid post haste, the Thorsten twins, Snotlout and Fishlegs. They're all chaotic enough to destroy an entire armada on their own. Cliffy, you're utterly ridiculous. Finn said firmly. Sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this, Cliff. Hiccup said, chortling with the council members. It came to me in a fever dream. Adriana took an empty seat beside Genevieve, still giggling madly. See, this is why we need a Cliffy on our team. Cliff's amusement vanished. What do you mean? Someone's gotta cut through the stress. We haven't laughed this much in days. Hey, yeah, comic relief is always the best part of the A-team. Cliff said, but he sounded less enthusiastic than before. Oh. Rough Nut said suddenly, whipping around from her place at Helga's side. Tough Nut and I are exceptional comic relief. Yes, there's usually one in every generation. You should be grateful Tough Nut isn't here, Hiccup. Otherwise he'd be the one to ask you if the rumors are true. Oh boy. Eric sighed. Do I want to know? Hiccup asked. Of course not, which is naturally why I'm going to tell you. Rough Nut said, ignoring her daughter's raised brow. I mean, if it was me who may or not have a suspiciously mysterious dragon tattoo located on their left cheek, I'd want to know who was starting the rumors. Thuggery gagged on his tea amid the chorus of barked laughter and snorts. You know, the thing about rumors, Rough Nut Hiccup said tightly, willing himself not to blush. Is they usually based in fantasy or jealousy. So what's that say about your brother, Rough Nut? Oh gods, please don't give him ideas. Helga said in a tight voice. You're not related to the man. With my luck, he'll get the dang thing and give me an unfortunate sight of the crescent moon to show me, probably on Snoggletalk, too. Adriana gaped at her. He wouldn't. Oh, trust me, he would. The Thorsten family isn't very well known for their shyness. It's a badge of honor. Rough Nut said. That's what he said. Eric muttered, earning another chorus of guffaws and a slap from his wife. Finn took the ice from Heather and began chucking ice cubes at his friends. See what you perverts started. Get out of here, you bunch of nasties. Hiccup kicked an ice cube away from his prosthetic and turned to share an amused look with Astrid, just as he always did. Then, realizing he'd forgotten for the 100th time that she wasn't here, felt his stomach clench. He was grateful for the laughter and for his friends and family that were doing their best to keep him sane and support him. But suddenly he was filled with the longing to see Astrid again. To know that she was safe and unhurt. How could an entire day without her feel like an eternity? A hand touched his arm and he turned to see Heather had taken up position at his side, now that Finn had commandeered the ice bag. How are you doing? Hiccup looked up at Finn, who'd sat up again and was still throwing ice cubes at Eric and Cliff. Eric had drawn up his hood and was hiding in its protective folds while Cliff had crumpled to the floor amidst claims of abuse. "I'm all right," he said finally. "I'm glad the kids got back safely. I'm worried about Astrid." "I know." Heather's blue eyes were steady, just as fearless as the day they'd first met all those years ago. "She'll be all right. She's strong and Brandine knows that. He won't do anything drastic. He will if she fights too much. She'll do whatever it takes to escape." "Maybe not. She's stubborn, but she's not stupid. She knows when to play her cards right, and this isn't the first time she's been kidnapped." Heather squeezed his arm. "She'll find her way back to us. I know it." Fighting the lump in his throat, Hiccup swallowed hard and nodded. He tried to think of how to respond but was spared the opportunity as the door was flung open. Snotlout stormed in, took in the now silent group with a quick sweep of his blue eyes, and then stalked for Hiccup. "What now?" Hiccup asked. "Not you." Snotlout hissed and stopped in front of Heather. "Did you tell her to go?" Heather stared at him for a long moment. "What are you talking about?" "Inga, obviously." "Inga? What about?" "She's gone, Heather. Misty's pen is empty, all of her riding gear is missing." The bowl in Mara's hands crashed to the floor and shattered. "What? No. No, did you check the brands?" "She might have gone to check on Tarin." "No, she's not there. She's not at the barracks or the arena or the house or with any of her friends. When I noticed Misty's pen was empty an hour ago, I started searching the village for her. Nobody's seen her since this morning." Heather had gone very white. The search party, the Changelings. Oh gods. She must have convinced them to let her go. Maybe even told them that the chief wanted a healer to go with them, just in case. It wouldn't take much to convince them. "But why?" Heather demanded. "Why would she?" "I'll tell you why." Finn huffed, running his hands down his face. "Because she was tired of waiting for no news. Because even after I convinced her not to go yesterday, she asked if something were to happen to Genevieve, would I stay or would I go? And she was right. I went after Genevieve." Heather slipped into a chair, her hands over her mouth. Snotlout was staring at the floor with a look of suppressed rage, which was fueled only by fear. "So she's on the reconnaissance mission," Hiccup said quietly. "She went after Alton." Chapter 10, Déjà Vu. Chapter text. Hiccup slid an idle finger around the rim of his mug, wondering how long ago the coffee must have cooled, untouched and unwanted. The great hall was quiet, save for a few council members who sat in various corners organizing information brought in by terrible terrors. The number of guards patrolling the perimeters and the skies. How many ships were ready for battle? How many more needed preparation until they too were ready? How many men and women were battle-ready with their dragons? How many men, women and children needed protecting, unable to fight themselves? On and on the preparation went. All of it being compiled for him. He tried not to think about how taxing it all was. This was why he had a council, to share the burden, to help keep him clear-headed. If only it was that simple. Exhaustion seemed to be weighing on the bones of everyone he saw. Too many all-nighters were being spent, and this was unwise should battle commence. He'd ordered many of the council members home to sleep hours ago. If they shouldn't return soon, however, he'd need to send the others off as well. He hated to risk losing time or track of preparations, but they were utterly lost if everyone keeled over from exhaustion. Also looking a little worse for wear, Finn sat beside him, nursing his own mug of coffee. He still hated the stuff, unless Genevieve made it with copious amounts of milk and caramel. Hiccup hardly thought that constituted as a true cup of coffee, but if it kept the edge of exhaustion at bay, he supposed it would suffice. Astrid would likely be scolding him for all the extra sugar and fat. A sting of pain echoed through his heart. Astrid. Was she all right? What was Brandine doing to her? Was she even still alive? "You should go home, Dad. Get some sleep." Hiccup glanced at him. "So should you. I'll go if you go." He smiled despite himself. "You'll go if I tell you to. Not the boss of me." Hiccup elbowed his son, who grinned. "Shut up." "No," Finn said. "Seriously. Eric told me you haven't been home since before Mom." He trailed off. "It's been 2 days. You're no use to anyone in a sleep coma. Or worse." "I know." Hiccup paused. "The thought of going home. I don't know if I can face it." Finn was quiet. "Because she's not there. Because we built that house together. And everything in it." Hiccup felt a sudden tightness in his throat. "What if she..." Don't think that." Finn held the empty mug in his hands, staring at it resolutely as if it would offer him better words to say. "But if it was me, and it was Jen gone, you'd tell me to go home. Regardless of the memories or feelings. In fact, you'd tell me that's exactly why I need to go home." He was right, of course. The night Brandine sent the box was a blur. Shock and horror had taken over his bones, and this after hours of worry. This past day was filled with resolved fervor to prepare Burke for the inevitable. But he still hadn't given himself the time to feel. To grieve. It felt selfish. It felt wrong. But of all people, Finn knew what it was like to bottle those feelings up and ignore them. To pretend like they didn't exist. "All right," Hiccup said at last. "I'll go now. While it's still quiet, before something else happens. I want you to." "I'll go in a bit. One of us should be here," Finn said firmly. "Jen is sleeping now, but she'll be here soon, no doubt. And I got some sleep after leaving Morris. I'll be fine for a bit." Hiccup took in his son's appearance. He looked a little bedraggled, but his blue eyes were clear and determined. "Go," his eyes seemed to be saying. "You've trained me for this. Let me take it for you." Nodding, Hiccup patted him on the shoulder. Before he could think on it more, he stood and headed for the doors. He briefly wondered where Toothless might have gotten to, but the quick patter of familiar footfalls followed him to the door. Toothless rumbled in his ear, an irritated sort of sound. Then he licked his face, drool seeping into his collar. "You, Toothless," Hiccup said, rubbing at his neck and cringing at the drool on his hand. "You know, almost 30 years and you'd think I'd get used to this. But you're as vile a creature as ever." Toothless rumbled in displeasure. "What, you don't know sarcasm when you hear it?" Hiccup asked, descending the stairs and looking around his village. He came to a slow halt, Toothless at his side. The early morning skies were a soft periwinkle blue, covered in dark clouds as if the very atmosphere was a reflection of his mood. Clouded, murky, confused. Overwhelmed. Perhaps it would rain soon. He hoped not. All the preparations would take even more time. Time they might not have. The village was already bustling with activity. It was too early to see many young mothers and children, but many men and women filled the streets, carrying various goods, armor, weapons and supplies to and fro. Carts were being filled to the maximum capacity to be taken down to the ships. While the majority of Burke's forces specialized in air fighting, Hiccup had never wanted his father's military prowess on the water to die with him. He'd kept many of his father's ship captains at the helm of their ships, some of which had now passed to their sons and even daughters. Seeing their organized preparation now made him thankful he'd never slacked in this area. It had been many years since Burke had seen open war, but for a moment he felt like a boy again, watching the villagers flurry for the next hunt on the Dragon's Nest. For a moment he fully expected his father to emerge around the nearest street, bellowing commands for half the village to hear, armor clanking at every footstep. Those days had always been filled with such excitement and a desire to prove himself. To his village, to his father. He'd always been shunted to the side, nobody willing to let him screw up their plans or botch any of their successes. A small grin pulled at his face at the memories. He supposed they all had a right to think of him as nothing short of a nincompoop, failure at everything and successful at nothing. Unless being a successful failure was the thing to strive for, of course. The memories faded along with his grin. His father was gone. In the years since, he had indeed proved himself. The dragon at his side was the very reason for that success. Everything had changed after that. His status as future chief, his newfound friendships, his allies across the sea, his life with Astrid and his kids. At the heart of it all, he still felt like that scrawny kid who was trying to prove himself. He hated going through life feeling like he had a chip on his shoulder, always needing to rise above the negativity and doubts. Those wounds had run deep as a child and young man, always present, always lingering. As an adult, life had never seemed to take a break from sending him some new trial or tribulation, always making him question if he was doing the right thing, if he was doing well enough, or what people thought of his leadership skills. Of course he'd failed on many occasions. And naturally he was harder on himself than he needed to be. Astrid said once that it was the cost of having a big heart. Always giving of yourself to be better than yourself when your own greatest enemy was yourself. And it was true. If he could give everything he and more to his people, to his family, he would. Not to prove that he wasn't a screw-up. Because he loved them and couldn't bear to see them in pain. The thought brought up the temptation to turn around and go back into the great hall. There was still so much to do, and even as he stood here with Toothless for the last few minutes, the periwinkle blue skies shifted to a muted grey. A new day was beginning. Why should he rest when he had more to give? When he'd already lost an entire night to moping? As if sensing these thoughts, Toothless rested his nose against his shoulder. He huffed a heavy breath, which seeped into his bones and brought more comfort than he thought he deserved. It was like one of Astrid's rare hugs. That painful lump rose in his throat again. "Come on, bud. Let's go home," Hiccup whispered. Toothless crooned as he mounted and then took off, angling down the steep hill and over the village. Flashes of faces turned up and waved or cheered as they passed, and he nodded in acknowledgement. It was all he could bear to give them. The cool salty air coming off the ocean was soothing. He found himself looking across the ocean at the crashing waves with a sudden sense of longing. To lose himself in the skies and the sea, the wind and the clouds. It was tempting, but also wasn't what Finn told him to do. Not that he should obey his own son, exactly, but he needed to go home. The skies and the sea would only provide a distraction from the real problem. Toothless swings ate up the distance faster than he would have liked. They crossed the bridge and were soon touching down in front of the house. Toothless hopped up the porch and tried to open the door for him, as if in trying to do something helpful for his sad and ailing boy like humans did. But after failing to turn the knob with his giant claws and then effectively covering a third of the door in more saliva, Hiccup sighed. "Listen, Bud," Hiccup gently pushed him aside. "I appreciate the attempt, but I think you're making it worse. And before you get ideas, no, you aren't allowed to make tea." Toothless grumbled. Hiccup wondered, cringing all while trying to open the door himself, if that hadn't been his intention. Gods, Toothless, how much drool. The door suddenly was flung open and a short sword was suddenly resting at his collarbone. Toothless let out a sharp cry. Firm dark eyes and a bush of curly blonde hair met his gaze as he jumped back. "Hiccup!" Genevieve squeaked. She brought the short sword away a second later. "It's you." "Yes, it's me," Hiccup said slowly, trying to process everything that had just happened in the span of 3 seconds. "Why are you armed in my house?" "Well, I spent the night here," Genevieve said, stepping aside and letting them in. "I woke a little bit ago and, well, I suddenly heard voices and scrabbling at the door. For a second well." She blushed crimson. "I thought someone might be here to kidnap you." Hiccup felt a strange mixture of amusement, concern and pride. "Well, thank you. Though I'm concerned that if they had been here to kidnap me, they'd only find you. And I don't think any of us can handle Finn's explosion right now if you went missing." "No," Genevieve agreed. "I think we've had quite enough surprises to be getting on with." "Amen." Toothless shoved his nose into Genevieve's hair and inhaled deeply. Then he sneezed. "Ugh." "Toothless." "Sorry," Hiccup sighed, dropping into the nearest chair. "He's been especially gelatinous today." "Oh, you don't say," Genevieve said, pulling her shirt away from her skin and grimacing. "Big brute." Toothless gave a throaty chuckle and flounced away to his large lava rock settled in the corner of the room. He set the rock ablaze before curling up into a ball and falling fast asleep. "Like a big overgrown cat," Genevieve said with a smile. Her smile faded as she took in his appearance however. "How are you holding up?" Hiccup shrugged. "All right I guess." Genevieve nodded and grabbed a bag sitting by the door. "Well, I'm off to find Finn." "Do you know where he is?" "Great Hall. At least that's where he was when I left." She rolled her eyes. "I told him to go to bed and stay there. We're all going to need proper rest in the coming days." She paused, her hand on the door handle. "Unless you'd like company." Hiccup gave her a wan smile. "That's okay, General, I'll be all right." Her dark eyes seemed to flood with understanding, as if she knew that he needed to be alone. "All right. Well, I'll see you in a bit then. We'll let you know if anything happens." Hiccup nodded as she left. As soon as the door closed and her footsteps died away, the silence of the house became a living thing. Save for Toothless' heavy breaths, everything was painfully, eerily silent. He and Astrid had had to learn what a quiet house felt like after Finn moved out. Astrid especially had a difficult time with it. It had taken some time, but he'd actually come to enjoy it. It almost felt like retirement. He cracked a small smile. Now he wasn't sure if retirement would ever be his to claim. Or if he did, if he'd end up spending it alone. Everywhere he looked there were signs of her. The weapons hanging on the walls. The Kranzen she'd left on the arm of the couch. A pair of well-worn boots beside the door. Her favorite leather jacket. A romance book she'd taken to reading after Adriana's exciting synopsis, though she'd be loath to admit buying it. The whetstone on the table, a few inches from where his fingers rested on the table. Without realizing it, he'd sat in her usual chair, the place she always sat when she sharpened her weapons. He picked up the whetstone and let it slip through his fingers. It was well worn and well cared for. Just like everything Astrid touched. Even him, he realized. Everything she loved deeply. Unapologetically. She was the most loving, most loyal person he knew. She loved fiercest of everyone he knew. And not for the first time he wondered if that fierce, undying loyalty would get her killed at last. The thought sent a wave of fear through his soul, so fierce he thought he might drown beneath it. What was a life without Astrid? Should the worst happen, what would he do? The kids would be crushed, Darin would be confused, but in time they would heal. But he would never recover from such a loss. When the tears came, he didn't know. All he could focus on was the whetstone clutched in his hands as if it was some sort of anchor. As if it could bring her back to him safe and unharmed. But at the end of the day, it was just a whetstone, just as he was a man missing his wife, who might be lost to him forever. Adriana woke slowly, ensconced in a cocoon of warmth so comfy she hoped to never leave it. Even as she thought it, worries and doubts and fears began to pepper her mind. Where was her mom right now? Where was her dad? Had the Changeling spies come back yet? Was Inga still with them? A hand brushed the hair from her face and a kiss was pressed to her forehead. "Relax, Annie. Don't let the day start before you even open your eyes." Despite her half-awake, groggy state, she smiled. Slipping her arms around Eric's waist, she pulled herself flush to his body and sighed. "If you insist." Eric's laugh echoed through her skin to her bones. "I do." He slid his hands up her back and into her hair. It was so warm and comforting and utterly safe, she might have easily fallen back asleep again. And then her eyes flew open. "Where's Darin?" His hands tensed against her back. "In his bed, remember. He slept with us 2 nights ago, not last night." Adriana sat up. "I need to check." "Annie, he's fine." "Maybe, but I want to check." She ignored his grumbling as she climbed off of him. The air of the house was chilly as she tiptoed out of the room and down the hall. As quietly as she could, she cracked Darin's door open and peeked inside. He was nestled safely within his blankets among his toys, snoring blissfully. The toothless plush seemed to blink at her in the darkness. A pair of arms snaked around her waist and she stiffened in surprise. She hadn't even heard Eric come down the hall. Smiling, she relaxed into him as he set his chin on the top of her head. "See? Perfectly safe," Eric whispered. He peered at her and then kissed her temple, lingering slightly. "Come on, it's still early." Adriana gently closed the door. How did you get down here so quietly? I've got my muffler on, Eric said, lifting his prosthetic to show her the strip of thick material covering the brunt of the metal. It's not practical for the most part, but I figure it has some good uses. Like, sneaking up on unsuspicious wives in the dusky morning. Ah,